My name is Douglas Winner, and these are the stories of Prime Evil. Peter Straub's The Juniper Tree and Spinning Tales with the Dead by Charles L. Grant, read by James B. Sicking, and Alice's Last Adventure by Thomas Ligotti, read by Lisa McMillan. Mirror, mirror on the wall, just what do we see there, and what stares back at us? Come with me now, through the looking glass, into a land of wonder and terror, as Thomas Ligotti takes us on Alice's Last Adventure.
Preston, stop laughing. They ate the whole backyard. They ate your mother's favorite flowers. It's not funny, Preston. A long time ago, Preston Penn made up his mind to ignore the passing years and to join the ranks of those who remain forever in a kind of half-world between childhood and adolescence. He would not give up the bold satisfaction of eating insects. Crispy flies and crunchy beetles are his favorites, nor that peculiar drunkenness of a child's brain, induplicable once grown-up sobriety has set perniciously in. The result was that Preston successfully negotiated several decades without ever coming within hailing distance of puberty. He lived unchanged throughout many a perverse adventure in the 40s and 50s and even into the 60s. He lived long after I ceased writing about him. Did he have a prototype? I should say so. One doesn't just invent a character like Preston using only the pitiful powers of imagination. He was very much a concoction of reality, later adapted for my popular series of children's books. Preston's status in both reality and imagination has always had a great fascination for me. In the past year, however, this issue has especially demanded my attention, not without some personal annoyance and even anxiety. Then again, perhaps I'm just getting senile. My age is no secret, since it can be looked up in a number of literary reference sources. See children's authors of today, whose information is only a few years off. I won't tell you in which direction. Over 2 decades ago, when the last Preston book appeared, Preston and the Upside-Down Face, one reviewer rather snootily referred to me as the grand damned of a particular sort of children's literature. What sort you can imagine if you don't otherwise know, if you didn't grow up, or not grow up, as it were, reading Preston's adventures with the Dead Mask, the Starving Shadows, or the Lonely Mirror. Even as a little girl, I knew I wanted to be an author, and I also knew just the kinds of things I would write. Let someone else give the pre-adolescents their literary introductions to life and love, guiding them through those volatile years when anything might go wrong, and landing them safely on the shores of incipient maturity. That was never my destiny. I would write about my adventures with Preston, my real-life childhood playmate, as everybody knew. Preston would then initiate others into the mysteries of an upside-down, inside-out, sinistral, always faintly askew, if not entirely reversed, universe. A true avatar of topsy-turvydom, Preston gave himself body and soul to the search, in commonplaces such as pools of rainwater, tarnished ornaments, November afternoons, for zones of fractured numinosity, usually with the purpose of fracturing in turn the bizarre icons of his foul and bloated twin, the adult world. He became a conjurer of stylish nightmares, and what he could do with mirrors gave the grown-ups fits and sleepless nights. No dilettante of the extraordinary, but its embodiment. Such is the spiritual biography of Preston Penn. But I suppose it was my father, as much as Preston's original, who inspired the stories I've written. To put it briefly, Father had the blood of a child coursing through his big adult body, nourishing the over-sophisticated brain of Foxborough College's associate professor of philosophy. Typical of his character was a love for the books of Lewis Carroll, and thus the genesis of my name, if not my subsequent career. My mother told me that while she was pregnant, Father willed me into a little Alice. Father thought of Carroll not merely as a clever storyteller, but more as an inhumanly jaded aesthete of the imagination, no doubt projecting some of his own private values onto poor Mr. Dodgson. To him, the author of the Alice books was, I think, a personal symbol of power, the strange ideal of an unstructured mind manipulating reality to its whim and gaining a kind of objective force through the minds of others. It was very important that I share these books, and many other things, in the same spirit. "See, honey," he would say while rereading through the looking-glass to me, "see how smart little Alice right away notices that the room on the other side of the mirror is not as tidy as the one she just came from. Not as tidy," he repeated with professorial emphasis, but chuckling like a child, a strange little laugh that I inherited from him. Not tidy. And we know what that means, don't we? I would look up at him and nod with all the solemnity that my 6, 7, 8 years could muster. And I did know what that meant. I felt intimations of 1,000 discreet and misshapen marvels, of things going wrong in curious ways, of the edge of the world where an endless ribbon of road continued into space by itself, of a universe handed over to new gods. Father would gaze at my round little face, squinting his eyes as if I were giving off light. Moon face, he called me. When I got older, my features became more angular, an involuntary betrayal of my father's conception of his little Alice, among all the other betrayals, once I'd broken the barrier of maturity. I suppose it was a blessing that he did not live to see me grow up and change, saved from disappointment by a sudden explosion in his brain while he was giving a lecture at the college. But perhaps he would have perceived, as I did not for many years, that my change was illusory, that I merely picked up the conventional gestures of an aging soul, nervous breakdown, divorce, remarriage, alcoholism, widowhood, a stoic tolerance of a second-rate reality, all without destroying the Alice he loved. She was always kept very much alive, though relegated to the role of an author for children. Obviously she endured, because it was she who wrote all those books about her soulmate Preston, even if she has not written one for many years now. Not too many, I hope. Oh, those years, those years. So much for the past. At present, I would like to deal with just a single year, the one ending today, about an hour from now, judging by the clock that 5 minutes ago chimed 11 p.m. from the shadows on the other side of this study. During the past 365 days, I have noticed, sometimes just barely, an accumulation of peculiar episodes in my life. A lack of tidiness, you might say. As a result, I've been drinking heavily again, and loneliness is getting to me in ways it never did in the past. Oh, the past. Some of these episodes are so elusive and insubstantial that it would be impossible to talk about them sensibly, except perhaps in the moods they leave behind like fingerprints, and which I've learned to read like divinatory signs. My task will be much easier if I confine myself to recounting but a few of the incidents, thereby giving them a certain form and structure I so badly need just now. A tidying up, so to speak. I should start by identifying tonight as that sacred eve that Preston always devotedly observed, celebrating it more intensely in Preston and the Ghost of the Gourd. At least there should be a few minutes remaining of this immovable feast, according to the clock ticking at my back, though from the look of things the hand seemed stuck on the time I reported a couple of paragraphs ago. Perhaps I misjudged it before. For the past several years, I've made an appearance at the local suburban library on this night to give a reading from one of my books as the main event of an annual Halloween fest. Tonight I managed to show up once again for the reading, even if I hesitate to say everything went as usual. Last year, however, I did not make it at all to the costume party. This brings me to what I think is the first in a year-long series of disruptions, unknown to a biography previously marked by nothing more than episodes of conventional chaos. My apologies for taking 2 steps backward before 1 step forward. As an old-handed storytelling, I realize this is always a risky approach when bidding for a reader's attention. But here goes. Around this time last year, I attended the funeral of someone from my past. Long past. This was none other than that sprite of special genius whose exploits served as the prima materia for my Preston Pen books. The gesture was one of pure nostalgia, for I hadn't actually seen this person since my 12th birthday party. It was soon afterward that my father died, and my mother and I moved out of our house in North Sable, Mass., heading for the big city and away from sad reminders. A local teacher who knew of my work and its beginnings in North S sent me a newspaper clipping from the Sable Sentinel, which reported the demise of my former playmate and even mentioned his second-hand literary fame. I arrived in town very quietly and was immediately overwhelmed by the lack of change in the place, as if it had existed all those years in a state of suspended animation and had been only recently reanimated for my benefit. It almost seemed that I might run into my old neighbors, schoolmates, and even Mr. So-and-so who ran the ice cream shop, which I was surprised to see still in operation. On the other side of the window, a big man with a walrus mustache was digging ice cream from large cardboard cylinders, while 2 chubby kids pressed their bellies against the counter. The man hadn't changed in the least over the years. He looked up and saw me staring into the shop, and there really seemed to be a twinkle of recognition in his puffy eyes. But that was impossible. He never could have perceived behind my ancient mask the child's face he once knew, even if he had been Mr. So-and-so and not his look-alike son, grandson. 2 complete strangers gawking at each other through a window smeared with the sticky handprints of sloppy patrons. The scene depressed me more than I can say. Unfortunately, an even more depressing reunion waited a few steps down the street. G.V. Ness & Sons, funeral directors. For all those years I'd lived in North Sable, this was only my 2nd visit to that cold colonial building. But such places always seem familiar. That perfectly vacant, neutral atmosphere common to all funeral homes. The same in my hometown as in the suburb outside New York, where I'm now secluded. I strolled into the proper room unnoticed, another anonymous mourner who was a bit shy about approaching the casket. Although I drew a couple of small-town stares, the elderly, elegant author from New York did not stand out as much as she thought she would. But with or without distinction, it remained my intention to introduce myself to the widow as a childhood friend of her deceased husband. This intention, however, was shot all to hell by 2 ox-like men who rose from their seats on either side of the grieving lady and approached me. For some reason, I panicked. "You must be Dad's cousin Winnie from Boston. The family's heard so much about you over the years." I smiled widely and gulped deeply, which must have looked like a nod of affirmation to them. In any case, they led me over to Mom and introduced me under my inadvertent pseudonym to the red-eyed, half-delirious old woman. Why, I wondered, did I allow this goof to go on? "Nice to finally meet you, and thank you for the lovely card you sent," she said, sniffing loudly and working on her eyes with a grotesquely soiled handkerchief. "I'm Elsie." Elsie Chester, I thought immediately, though I wasn't entirely sure that this was the same person who was rumored to have sold kisses and other things to the boys at North Sable Elementary. So he had married her. What do you know? Possibly they had to get married, I speculated cattily. At least one of her sons looked old enough to have been the consequence of teenage impatience. Oh, well, so much for Preston's vow to wed no one less than the Queen of Nightmares. But even greater disappointments awaited my notice. After chatting emptily with the widow for a few more moments, I excused myself to pay my respects at the coffin side of the deceased. Until then, I deliberately averted my gaze from that flower-crazed area at the front of the room, where a shiny pearl-gray casket held its occupant in much the same position as the traveling tomb racer he'd once constructed. The whole stale ritual reminded me of those corpse-viewing sessions to which children in the 19th century were subjected in order to acquaint them with their own mortality. At my age, this was unnecessary, so allow me to skip quickly over this scene with a few tragic and inevitable words. Bald and blemished. That was unconsciously expected. Totally unfamiliar. That wasn't. The mosquito-faced child I once knew had had his features smushed and spread by the years, bloated, not with death, but with having overfed himself at the turgid banquet of life, lethargically pushing away from the table just prior to explosion. A portrait of lazy indulgence, defunct, used up, the eternal adult. But perhaps in death, I consoled myself, a truer self was even now ripping off the false face of the thing before me. This must be so, for the idea of an afterworld populated with a preponderance of old withered souls is too hideous to contemplate. After paying homage to the remains of a memory, I slipped out of that room with a stealth my Preston would have been proud of. I'd left behind an envelope with a modest contribution to the Widow's Fund. I had half a mind to send a batch of gaping black orchids to the funeral home with a note signed by Letitia Simpson, Preston's dwarfish girlfriend. But this was something that the other Alice would have done, the one who wrote those strange books. As for me, I got into my car and drove out of town to a nice big Holiday Inn near the interstate, where I found a nice suite, spoils of a successful literary career, and a bar. And as it turned out, this overnight layover must take us down another side road, or back road, if you like, of my narrative. Please stand by. A late afternoon crowd had settled into the motel's barroom, relieving me of the necessity of drinking in total solitude, which at the time I was quite prepared to do. After a couple of scotches on the rocks, I noticed a young man looking my way from the other side of that greenish room. At least he appeared young, extremely so from a distance. But as I walked over to sit at his table, with a boldness I've never attributed to alcohol, he seemed to gain a few years with every step I took. He was now only relatively young, from an old dowager's point of view, that is. His name was Hank DeVere, and he worked for a distributor of gardening tools and other such products in Maine. But let's not pretend to care about the details. Later we had dinner together, after which I invited him to my suite. It was the next morning, by the way, that inaugurated that year-long succession of experiences which I'm methodically trying to sort out with a few select examples. Half step forward coming up, pawn to king 3. I awoke in the darkness peculiar to motel bedrooms, abnormally heavy curtains masking the morning light. Immediately it became apparent that I was alone. My new acquaintance seemed to have a more developed sense of tact and timing than I had given him credit for. At least I thought so at first. But then I looked through the open doorway into the other room, where I could see a convex mirror in an artificial wood frame on the wall. The bulging eye of the mirror reflected almost the entire next room, in varying degrees of convex distortion, and I noticed someone moving around in there, in the mirror, that is. A tiny, misshapen figure seemed to be gyring about, leaping almost, in a way that should have been audible to me, but it wasn't. I called out a name I barely remembered from the night before. There came no answer from the next room, but the movement in the mirror stopped, and the tiny figure, whatever it was, disappeared. Very cautiously, I got up from the bed, robed myself, and peeked around the corner of the doorway like a curious child on Christmas morning. A strange combination of relief and confusion arose in me when I saw that there was no one else in the suite. I approached the mirror, perhaps to search its surface for the fly that might have caused the illusion. My memory is a little vague on this point, since at the time I was a bit hungover. But I can recall with spectacular vividness what I finally saw after gazing into the mirror for a few moments. Suddenly, the sphered glass before me became clouded with a mysterious fog, from the depths of which appeared the waxy face of a corpse. It was the visage of that old cadaver I'd seen at the funeral home, now with eyes open and staring reproachfully into mine. Of course, I really saw nothing of the kind. I did not even imagine it, except just now. But somehow, this imaginary manifestation seems more fitting and conclusive than what I actually found in the mirror, which was only my old and haggard face. A corpse-like countenance, if ever there was one. But there was another conclusion, let's say encore, to this episode with the mirror. A short while later, I was checking out of the motel, and as the desk clerk was fiddling with my bill, I happened to look out of a nearby window, beyond which 2 children were romping on the lawn in front of the motel. An arm-swinging, leaping mime show. After a few seconds, the kids caught me watching them. They stopped and stared back at me, standing perfectly still, side by side. Then suddenly they were running away. The room took a little spin that only I seemed to notice, while others went calmly about their business. Possibly this experience can be attributed to my failure to employ the usual post-debauch remedies that morning. The old nerves were somewhat shot, and my stomach was giving me no peace. Still, I was, and am, in pretty good shape for my years, and I drove back to New York without further incident. That was a year ago. Get ready for one giant step forward. The old queen is now in play. In the succeeding months, I noted a number of similar happenings, though they occurred with varying degrees of clarity. Most of them approached the fleeting nature of déjà vu phenomena. A few could almost be pegged as self-manufactured, while others lacked a definite source. I might see a phrase or the fragment of an image that would make my heart flip over, not a healthy thing at my age, while my mind searched for some oblique correspondence that triggered this powerful sense of repetition and half-familiarity, the sound of a delayed echo with indirect origins. I delved into dreams, unconscious perceptions, and the distortions of memory, but all that remained was a chain of occurrences with links as weak as smoke rings. And today, 1 year later, this tenuous haunting has regained the clarity of the first incident at the motel. Specifically, I refer to a pair of episodes that have caused me to become a little insecure about my psychic balance, and to attempt to confirm my lucidity by writing it all out. Organization is what's needed. Thus, Episode 1. Place, the bathroom. Time, a little after 8 a.m., the last day of October. The water was running for my morning bath, cascading into the tub a bit noisily for my sensitive ears. The night before, I suffered from an advanced case of insomnia, which even extra doses of my beloved Guardsman Reserve stock did not help. I was very glad to see a sunny autumn morning come and rescue me. My bathroom mirror, however, would not let me forget the sleepless night I'd spent, and I combed and creamed myself without noticeable improvement. Sandal was with me, lying atop the toilet tank and scrutinizing the waters of the bowl below. She was actually staring very hard and deliberately at something. I'd never seen a cat stare at its own reflection, and have always been under the impression that they cannot see reflected images of themselves. Lucky them. But this one saw something. "What is it, Sandal?" I asked with the patronizing voice of a pet owner. Her tail had a life of its own. She stood up and hissed, then yowled in that horribly demonic falsetto of threatened felines. Finally, she dashed out of the bathroom, relinquishing her ground for the first time in all my memory of her. I had been loitering at the other side of the room, a groggy bystander to an unexpected scene. With a large plastic hairbrush gripped in my left hand, I investigated. I gazed down into the same waters, and though at first they seemed clear enough, something soon appeared from within that porcelain burrow. It had dozens of legs and looked all backward and inside out. But what was most disgusting about the thing was that it had a tiny human head, one like a baby's except all blue and shriveled. This latter part, of course, is an exaggeration, or rather it's an alarm without a fire. It helps if I can tack a neat storybook finish onto these episodes, because what seem to be their real conclusions just leave me hanging. You can't have stories end that way and still expect to hold your reader's esteem. Some genius once said that literature was invented the first time a certain boy cried wolf, and there was none. I suppose this is what I'm doing now, crying wolf. Not that it's my intention to make a fiction out of what is real. Much too real, judging by my recent overdrinking and resultant late-night vomiting sessions. But stories, even very nasty ones, are traditionally considered more satisfying than reality, which, as we all know, is a grossly overrated affair. So don't worry about my cries of wolf, even if it turns out that I'm making everything up. At least what you have left can be enjoyed as a story. No small value to my mind. It's just a different story, that's all. One about another old lady author of children's yarns, which, incidentally, has nothing to do with the truth, one way or the other. So, yes, I was in the bathroom staring into the toilet bowl. The truth is that there was nothing in there, except nice, disinfected water of a bluish tint. The water was still like a miniature lake, and cruelly reflected a miniature face. That's all I really saw, my hysterical kitty notwithstanding. I gazed at my wrinkled self in the magic pool for a few minutes longer, and then cocked the handle to flush it away. You were right, Father. It doesn't pay to get old and ugly. I spent the rest of the morning lying around the baggy old suburban home my second husband left me when he died some years ago. An old war movie on television helped me pass the time. And vain lady that I am, what I remember most about the war is the shortage of silk and other luxury items, like the quicksilver needed to make a mirror of superior reflective powers. In the afternoon, I began preparing myself for the reading I was to give at the library, the preparation being mostly alcoholic. I've never looked forward to this annual ordeal and only put up with it out of a sense of duty, vanity, and other less comprehensible motives. Maybe this is why I welcomed the excuse to skip it last year. And I wanted to skip it this year, too, if only I could have come up with a reason satisfactory to the others involved, and, more importantly, to myself. Wouldn't want to disappoint the children, would I? Of course not. Though heaven only knows why. Children have made me nervous ever since I stopped being one of them. Perhaps this is why I never had any of my own. Adopted any, that is, for the doctors told me long ago that I'm as fertile as the seas of the moon. The other Alice is the one who's really comfortable with kids and kiddish things. How else could she have written Preston and the laughing this, or Preston and the twitching that? So when it comes time to do this reading every year, I try to put her on stage as much as possible. Oddly enough, it's my grown-up's weakness for booze that allows me to do this most effectively. Each drink I had this afternoon peeled away a few more winters, and soon I was ready to confront the most brattish child without fear. Which leads me to introduce Episode 2. Place, the car in the driveway. Time, a radiant twilight. With a selection of Preston stories on the seat beside me, I was still undecided on which to read, hoping for inspiration. I was off to do my duty at the library. A routine adjustment of the rearview mirror straightened the slack-mouth angle it had somehow assumed since I'd last driven the car. The image I saw in the mirror was also routine. Across the street and staring into my car by way of the rear window was the odious and infinitely old Mr. Thompson. Worse than E. Nesbitt's U.W. Ugly, let me assure you. He seemed to appear out of nowhere, for I hadn't seen him when I was getting into the car. But there he was now, ogling the back of my head. This was quite normal for the lecherous old boy, and I didn't think anything of it. While I was adjusting the mirror, however, a strange little trick took place. I must have hit the switch that changes the position of the mirror for night driving, flipping it back and forth very quickly like the snap of a camera. So what I saw for an instant was a nighttime negative version of Mr. Thompson as he stood there with his hands deep in his trouser pockets. What a horrendous idea. The unappealingly lubricous Thompson on this side of reality is bad enough without anti-Thompsons running around and harassing me for dates. Oh, thank goodness there's only one of everybody, I thought. But then again, perhaps the other Mr. T would be completely inverted, and thus no longer a threat to aged but well-preserved women. I didn't pull out of the driveway until I saw Thompson move on down the sidewalk, which he did after a few moments, leaving me to stare at my own shriveled eye sockets in the rearview mirror. The sun was going down in a pumpkin-colored blaze when I arrived at the little one-story library. Some costumed kids were hanging around outside, a werewolf, a black cat with a long curling tail, and what looked like an Elvis Presley, or at least some teen idol of a bygone age. And coming up the walk were two identical Tinkerbells, who I later found out were Tracy and Trina Martin. I had forgotten about twins. So much for the comforting notion that there's only one of everybody. I was actually feeling quite confident, even as I entered the library and suddenly found myself confronted with a huddling mass of youngsters. But then the spell was broken maliciously when some anonymous smart aleck called out from the crowd saying, "Hey, look at the mask she's wearing." After that, I propelled myself down several glossy linoleum hallways in search of a friendly adult face. Someone should give that wisecracker a copy of Struwwelpeter. Let him see what happens to his kind of kid. Finally, I passed the open door of a tidy little room where a group of ladies and the head librarian, Mr. Groz, were sipping coffee. Mr. Groz said how nice it was to see me again and introduced me to the moms who were helping out with the party. "My William's read all your books," said a Mrs. Harley, as if she were relating a fact to which she was completely indifferent. "I can't keep him away from them." I didn't know whether or not to thank her for this comment, and ended up replying with a dignified and slightly liquor-tinged smile. Mr. Groz offered me some coffee, and I declined, bad for the stomach. Then he wickedly suggested that, as it was getting dark outside, the time seemed right for the festivities to begin. My reading was to inaugurate the evening's fun, a good spooky story to get everyone in the mood. First, though, I needed to get myself in the mood, and discreetly retired to a nearby ladies' room where I could refortify my fluttering nerves. Mr. Groz, in one of the strangest and most embarrassing social gestures I've ever witnessed, offered to wait right outside the lavatory until I finished. "I'm quite ready now, Mr. Groz," I said, glaring down at the little man from atop an unelderly pair of high heels. He cleared his throat, and I almost thought he was going to extend a crooked arm for me to take. But instead he merely stretched it out, indicated the way to an old woman who might not see as well as she once did. He led me back down the hallway towards the children's section of the library, where I assumed my reading would take place, as it always had in the past. However, we walked right by this area, which was dark and ominously empty, and proceeded down a flight of stairs leading to the library's basement. "Our new facility," bragged Mr. Groz, "converted one of the storage rooms into a small auditorium of sorts." Down at the end of the hallway, two large green doors faced each other on opposite walls. "Which one will it be tonight?" asked Mr. Groz while staring at my left hand. "Preston and the Starving Shadows," I answered, showing him the book that I was holding. He smiled and confided that it was one of his favorites. Then he opened the door to the library's new facility. Over 50 kids were sitting, quietly, in their seats. At the front of the long, narrow room, a big witch was outlining the party activities for the night, and when she saw Mr. Groz and me enter, she began telling the children about a special treat for us all, meaning that the half-crocked lady author was about to give her half-cocked oration. Walking a very straight line to the front, I took the platform and thanked everyone for that nice applause. most of it, in fact, coming from the sweaty hands of Mr. Gross. On the platform was a lamp-bearing podium decorated with wizened cornstalks. I fixed my book in place before me, disguising my apprehension with a little stage patter about the story everyone was going to hear. When I invoked the name of Preston Penn, a few kids actually cheered, or at least one did. Just as I was ready to begin reading, however, the lights went out, which was rather unexpected, and for the first time I noticed that facing each other on opposite sides of the room were 2 rows of jack-o'-lanterns, shining bright orange and yellow in the darkness. They all had identical faces, triangular eyes and noses, wailing O's for mouths, and could have been mirror reflections of themselves. As a child, I was convinced that pumpkins naturally grew this way, complete with facial features and phosphorescent insides. Furthermore, they seemed to be suspended in space, the darkness concealing their means of support. As the blackness prevented my seeing the faces of the children, these jack-o'-lanterns became my audience. But as I read, the real audience asserted itself with giggles, whispers, and some rather ingenious noises made with the folding wooden chairs they were sitting in. At one point, toward the end of the reading, there came a low moan from somewhere in the back, and it sounded as if someone had fallen out of his seat. "It's all right," I heard an adult voice call out. The door at the back opened, allowing a moment of brightness to break the spooky spell, and some shadows exited. When the lights came on at the end of the story, one of the seats toward the back was missing its occupant. "Okay, kids," said the big witch after some minor applause for Preston. "Everyone move their chairs back to the wall and make room for the games and stuff." The games and stuff had the room in a low-grade uproar. Masked and costumed children ruled the night, indulging their appetite for movement, sweet things to eat and drink, and noise. I stood at the periphery of the commotion and chatted with Mr. Gross. "What exactly was the disturbance all about?" I asked him. He took a sip from a plastic cup of cider and smacked his lips offensively. "Oh, nothing really. You see that child there with the black cat outfit? She seemed to have fainted. Not entirely, of course. Once we got her outside, she was all right. She was wearing her kitty mask all through your reading, and I think the poor thing hyperventilated or something like that. Complained that she saw something horrible in her mask and was very frightened for a while. Oh, at any rate, you can see she's fine now, and she's even wearing her mask again. Amazing how children can put things right out of their minds and recover so quickly." I agreed that it was amazing, and then asked precisely what it was the child thought she saw in her mask. I couldn't help being reminded of another cat earlier in the day who also saw something that gave her a fright. "She couldn't really explain it," replied Mr. Gross. "You know how it is with children. Yes, I dare say you do know how it is with them, considering you've spent your life exploring the subject." I took credit for knowing how it is with children, knowing instead that Mr. Gross was really talking about someone else, about her. Not to overdo this quaint notion of the split between my professional and my private personae, but at the time I was already quite self-conscious about the matter. While I was reading the Preston book to the kids, I had had the uncanny experience of having almost no recognition of my own words. Of course, this is rather a cliché with writers, and it has happened to me many times throughout my long career, but never so completely. They were the words of a mind, I stopped just short of writing soul, entirely alien to me. This much I would like to note in passing, never to be mentioned again. "I do hope," I said to Mr. Gross, "that it wasn't the story that scared the child. I have enough angry parents on my hands as it is." "Oh, I'm sure it wasn't. Not that it wasn't a good, scary children's story. I didn't mean to imply that, of course. But you know, it's that time of year. Imaginary things are supposed to seem more real. Like your Preston. He was always a big one for Halloween, am I right?" I said he was quite right, and hoped he would not pursue the subject. The reality of fictional characters was not at all what I wanted to talk about just then. I tried to laugh it away. "And you know, Father, for a moment it was exactly like your own laugh, and not my usual hereditary impersonation of it." Much to everyone's regret, I did not stay very long at the party. The reading had largely sobered me up, and my tolerance level was running quite low. Yes, Mr. Graz, I promise to do it again next year. Anything you say, just let me get back to my car and my bar. The drive home through the suburban streets was something of an ordeal, made hazardous by pedestrian trick-or-treaters. The costumes did me no good. The same ghost was everywhere. The masks did me no good. And those Prestonian shadows fluttering against two-story facades certainly did me no good at all. This was not my place anymore. Not my style. Dr. Guardsman, administer your medicine in tall glasses, but please not looking ones. And now I'm safe at home with one of the tallest of those glasses resting full and faithful on my desk as I write. A lamp with a shade of Tiffany glass, circa 1922, casts its amiable glow on the many pages I filled over the past few hours, although the hands of the clock seem locked in the same V position as when I started writing. The lamplight shines upon the window directly in front of my desk, allowing me to see a rather flattering reflection of myself in the black mirror of the glass. The house is soundless, and I'm a rich, retired authoress widow. Is there still a problem? I'm really not sure. I remind you that I've been drinking steadily since early this afternoon. I remind you that I'm old and no stranger to the mysteries of senile neuroticism. I remind you that some part of me has written a series of children's books whose hero is a disciple of the bizarre. I remind you of what night this is and to what zone the imagination can fly on this particular eve. But we can discount this last one owing to my status as an elderly cynic and disbeliever. I need not, however, remind you that this world is stranger than we know, or at least mine seems to be, especially this past year, and I now notice that it's very strange, and once again, untidy. Exhibit 1. Outside my window is a late October moon hanging in the blackness. Now, I have to confess that I'm not up on lunar phases, loony faces, as Preston might say, but there seems to have been a switch since I last peeked out the window. The thing looks reversed. Where it used to be concaving to the right, it's now convexing in that direction. Last quarter changed to first quarter or something of that nature. But I doubt nature has anything to do with it. More likely the explanation lies with memory. And there's really not much troubling me about the moon, which, even if reversed, would still look as neat as a storybook illustration. The trouble is with everything else below, or at least what I can see of the suburban scape in the darkness. Like writing that can only be read in a mirror, the shapes outside my window, trees, houses, but thank goodness no people, now look awkward and wrong. Exhibit 2. To the earlier list of reasons for my diminished competence, I would like to add an upcoming alcohol withdrawal. The last sip I took out of that glass on my desk tasted indescribably strange. Strange to the point where I doubt I'll be having any more. I almost wrote, and now have, that the booze tasted inside out. Of course, there are certain diseases with the power to turn the flavor of one's favorite drink into that of a hell broth, so perhaps I've fallen victim to such a malady. But I remind you that I've never been physically ill a day in my life. Exhibit 3, the last. My reflection in the window before me. Perhaps something unusual in the melt of the glass. My face. The surrounding shadows seem to be overlapping it a little at a time, like bugs attracted to something sweet. But the only thing sweet about Alice is her blood, highly sugared over the years from her drinking habit. So what is it then? Shadows of senility? Or those starving things I read about earlier this evening come back for a repeat performance, another in a year-long series of echoes? But whenever that happens, it's always the reflection, the warped or imaginary image first, and then the real-life echo. Since when does reading a story constitute an incantation, calling up its imagery before the body's eyes and not the mind's? Something's backward here. Backward into a corner. Checkmate. Now perhaps this seems like merely another cry of wolf, the most elaborate one so far. I can't actually say that it isn't. I can't say that what I'm hearing right now isn't some Halloween trick of my besotted brain. The laughing out in the hallway, I mean. That childish chuckling. Even when I concentrate, I'm still not able to tell if the sound is inside or outside my head. It's like looking at one of those toy pictures that yield two distinct scenes when tilted this way or that, but at a certain angle form only a merging blur of them both. Nonetheless, the laughing is there, somewhere, and the voice is extremely familiar. Of course it is. No, it isn't. Yes, it is. It is. Exhibit 4. The shadows again. They're all over my face in the window, stripping away as in the story. But there's nothing under that old mask. No child's face there, Preston. It is you, isn't it? I've never heard your laughter except in my imagination, but that's exactly how I imagined it sounds. Or has my imagination given you, too, a hand-me-down, inherited laugh? My only fear is that it isn't you, but some imposter. The moon, the clock, the drink, the window. This is all very much your style, only it's not being done in fun, is it? It's not funny. Too horrible for me, Preston, or whoever you are. And who is it? Who could be doing this to a harmless old lady? Too horrible. The shadows in the window. No, not my face. I can't see anymore. I can't see. Help me. Father.
Sunlight and shadow. A rod, a reel, a picnic lunch. Family and friends. It's a perfect day for fishing. Or, as Charles L. Grant reveals, for spinning tales with the dead.
The stream was no more than a dozen feet across. Clear, fast, silver-slashed and smooth where rocks from its shallows pushed the surface toward the sun. Weeds draped over the banks. Spiders skated side to side. And in deeper pools there were slim and nervous fish that scattered to the center when a pebble dropped in or a spider skated too slow. The trees and branches were high, the underbrush thin. The daylight was almost as bright as if the stream had passed through a meadow. And there was shade. Beneath the fat and wrinkled sycamore, whose roots broke through the ground and were coated with moss, there was shade as cool as an early autumn evening, and Jerry Down never failed to bring his old denim jacket, even on the hottest of the worst days of July, or his floppy-brimmed cap with the lures pinned through the shapeless crown, or the paperback books in the knapsack for when the fishing was slow. In the old days, before he knew the agony of being a teenager, in a world that wanted him to grow up before his time, he brought lemonade or cola from the corner store or a bottle of root beer his father had made in the cellar. In his 20s, it was beer or a small earthen jug of Rooney's milky dandelion wine. Now, when he had a difficult time remembering just how old he was, though he was sure he wasn't old, He brought whatever he had in the refrigerator, whatever was left at the end of the week when he couldn't stand to stay home anymore. In the living room with the television screen blank and the radio dead and the neighbors on the prowl for people to visit. Pausing on the pavement to point at his house and whisper behind their hands. Sliding by at night in their slow-moving cars, running up to the porch to ring the doorbell and running away, pale faces, red with laughter once they crossed the street. Every day in the beginning, proving courage and strength. Once a week after a while, proving nothing at all, but that memories die hard when the dying was even harder. Halloween was the best time now, and the moonless December nights when the wind lurked in the hedge and the snow was thin and fresh on the ground, and the police had better things to do than to chase them away. How old was he wondered. It didn't matter. The sun was out and warm. It was long past noon, and he checked the bamboo pole for the 5th time in as many minutes, convincing himself it was still secure in its place between 2 large rocks that had been there since the first day he'd come, with Rooney, whose father had been a farrier until the farms around were sold to people who built houses and supermarkets and roads that followed the paths the cows took home to the barn. He opened a beer, took a drink, and looked at the fingers curled around the can. Long, short-nailed, knuckles slightly swollen, veins heavy and wide, just a hint of a tremble. "Bruni," he said, "this is getting to be a pain in the ass, you know." On the far side, between 2 cages of white birch, in a shower of mint light, a shadow stirred and came forward. Fly rod hooked loosely over its shoulder, battered reel dangling from one shoulder. "Wasn't my idea," Rooney said, grumbling. "You were the one who talked me out here in the first place. Soon as you stop coming, so will I. Never did like it anyway. Never knew worms could bleed." Jerry sighed, drank again, and set the can on a space flattened by years of using it for a table. "They don't bleed. How many times do I have to tell you?" Rooney worked at a tangle in his reel. "They got stuff coming out of them. That's blood enough for me." Jerry raised an eyebrow, gave a groan to himself, and looked down at the boy sitting beside him. A small boy, not much more than 9 or 10, red-headed, freckled, wearing brand-new jeans and a shirt that was too snug for the warmth of the sun. He was staring into the water, humming to himself and rocking his head back and forth. Jerry touched the red hair lightly, and the boy squirmed as if touched by the exploring of a spider. Leaves gossiped overhead when the breeze darted through. The line from the bamboo pole was pulled downstream by the rush of the current. The sky was a darkening blue in puzzled pieces through the foliage, and Jerry hunched his shoulders, relaxed them, reached out and tested the pole's shoring again. He refused to believe that one day it wouldn't pull loose at the yank of a bite. He refused to believe that one day he'd come here alone, without the boy, without Rooney, or without the woman coming toward him over there, daintily picking her way through the low brush and cattails on the other side of the water. Her hair was dark, her complexion a mottled tan. The dress she wore was made more for walking down a street at Easter than walking through the woods in the summer, when all the flies seemed determined to settle on his face and reminded him that soon they'd be feeding there as well. She didn't complain. She never looked up. She stopped at the first cage and looked through it to Rooney, who looked back without a nod or even a wink of recognition. Jerry waited to see if anything would be said. There was always a first time. A cloud cut off a slice of the sun, and shadows sprang from their burrows to hide her face, make Rooney vanish and return as the cloud moved on. Leaving behind a cool Jerry couldn't seem to shake, no matter how hard he blew on his hands, no matter how often he told himself that this time would be the last, this time would end it, and he'd be alone with the stream. The boy shifted himself to sit closer to the water, down the short slope of the grassy bank that seemed forever poised on the edge of collapse. He wiped his nose with a sleeve. He picked up a pebble and tossed it into the pool at Rooney's feet, paying no attention to the look the bald man gave him, or to the smile from the woman whose lips were wide and red. "F," the how-old man said, quietly and sternly. The boy looked over his shoulder, no life in his eyes, and looked back and threw another pebble into the pool at Rooney's feet. Jerry had thought from the second his son had been born that it was a crime to name a kid Ephraim in this day and age. His friends at school were nice enough, he supposed, but he knew they wondered. Ephraim. What kind of a name was that for a kid who only wanted to grow up and knock the hell out of baseballs? It wasn't his idea, and the woman wasn't talking. Never had. "Damn trees," Rooney muttered, tugging at his line, which was trapped in the crook of an overhanging branch. "This isn't the place for one of those," Jerry told him, had been telling him for 30 years, probably more. "Gotta use it," the old man said. "It was a gift." "I didn't give it to you to use here, you old jackass," Jerry snapped. "It was for the boat they were going to have. The one they were going to sail along the East Coast, sailing up rivers along the way, seeing new towns, new friends, new kinds of fish they could bring home to show their families, for the times they would have when retirement forced them out, but before age forced them into caves where they'd be displayed like stuffed animals in museums. For the pictures they'd show their families when they returned from their travels, Rooney on a dock, grinning with a 50-pound something or other hanging at his side. The woman found herself a dry place on the bank, hiked her skirt a little, and sat. She was whistling. She was working her shoes and stockings off so her feet could feel the cold shock of the water. Jerry willed her to go away. She looked up and smiled. "You know, F," he said, looking away and down and touching the boy's hair again, "once upon a time I decided I was going to be president of the United States." F didn't look around, but he knew the boy was listening. "That's right. I decided to chuck it all, the security of a good job, the love of a good woman, friends and family, and spend my millions becoming head of this country so I could straighten it all out before it fell into disrepair. I ran a good race, too. Took more seats than the papers said I would, and some they said I wouldn't win on a cold day in hell." He pulled in the line, hand over hand, clucked at the empty hook, and delicately wound and stabbed a new worm around it. "Trouble was, of course, Cody took more than I did. At least, he took the ones with the most electoral votes. That's what counts, you know. It don't matter how many people vote for you. If the other guy has the electoral votes, you're a footnote in the next history book unless you're stupid enough to try again." "Dad," the boy said, still not looking around, "you never ran for president." "Sure I did." "Against William Cody?" "Right." "He never did either." "Then who did all those people vote for? Sitting Bull?" The boy shook a little, and Jerry grinned. The first laugh of the day, and the day was nearly done. For a while he thought he'd lost the knack. He leaned back against the sycamore and took the pole in his hands, feeling the smoothness of it, the limber strength, the memories that had stained it dark brown here and there. He ran a palm along it as far as he could reach, not caring that he might be disturbing the fish trying to get the worm. It was the feel of fishing that counted, not the fish that were caught. Like it was the feel of living that counted, not the woman who was loved. So he had thought when he was younger. So he believed until the day he'd met Prue and lost all his sense and regained all his feeling. Now there, he thought, is another dumb name, Prudence. Who names their girl child Prudence anymore? Not since the Pilgrims, for God's sakes. Not until his Prue walked into his life without even bothering to knock. And when he glanced at his son, he couldn't help a sigh for the red hair and the freckles. None of it belonged to his wife. All of it was his, right down to the stub of a nose and the long piano-playing fingers. "God damn," Rooney said, yanking at another tangle, this one halfway up the rod. "Watch your mouth," Jerry said softly. "Go to hell," Rooney answered, yanked again, swore again when the line parted, and he was forced into his creel for another lure. The woman looked sideways up the stream and shook her head. Then she turned until she was facing the sun and tilted her head back, closed her eyes, pursed her lips, still whistling. Jerry nearly dropped the pole. He would still see it, the thin line of white along the slope of her throat, the spray of dried blood along the slopes of her breasts. "You know, F," he said, "this is the kind of day I used to take the ship out of dry dock and take off after whales." Ephraim tossed another pebble. "You never did." "Of course I did. You ought to know. You were there." The boy plucked at the grass beside him. "I was?" "First mate." A twitch on the cheek Jerry could see. Another cloud, wider and darker and more kind to the twilight that lifted from the woodland floor and made the stream at once brighter and deeper. "Moby Dick," Ephraim said in the brief darkening. "You had a peg leg then, right?" "Absolutely. You used to carve notches on it for every whale we caught." "We never did get the big white one, though, Dad." "Nope, we never did. No one ever does, F. The goddamn fish is bigger than any 10 ships put together and 100 times as tough. I have to admit, though, you were the best harpooner a captain could ever wish for." The boy punched a fist into a palm. "Got him right between the eyes, too," he said. "Should have had the creep, but he sneezed." Jerry sat forward. "He sneezed?" "Don't you remember? There you were, up in the crow's nest, screaming like an old woman, and I put that harpoon right between his eyes, and you kept shouting we should tie down the line more, and the whale got so sick of your yelling and spitting and waving your arms he got allergic. So he sneezed, and pop! The damn harpoon came right out, and I lost it." He shook his head sadly. "Best harpoon a man ever had." "Goddamn liar," Rooney said. "Watch it," Jerry warned him. "This isn't lying. This is tale-telling." Rooney rolled his eyes and gave up trying to tie a new hook and lure onto his line. He threw the rod down, sat down, and pulled the bottle from the creel. The drink was long, and some of it spilled over his chin where a piece of bone flared when the sun came out again. The woman was still sunning herself. The boy was back to tossing pebbles into the stream. Jerry stared at the length of bamboo in his hand and told himself it was all right. He wasn't exactly as young as he used to be, but he wasn't so old that he was going crazy. A look at the beer can and the 2 others lying empty beside it. And he wasn't drunk, not on 3 beers over the course of a few hours. He coughed loudly, then shifted. He said, "F, I ever tell you about the time I decided I ought to chuck it all and run for President of the United States?" "You just did, Dad," the boy said flatly. He nodded. Right, so he had. The woman kicked the water lightly, silver flashing from her toes, glittering tiny rainbows in the air before the breeze took them away. Then, with a glance at Jerry, she reached behind her and began to work on the buttons that ranged along her spine. Her chest was thrust out, her feet were still kicking. and he emptied the can of beer because his throat was abruptly dry. Rooney was watching. The boy was watching a dragonfly hovering over the stream, swinging with the direction of the breeze, wings like paddles. From his hip pocket he pulled out a penknife and thumbnailed out its longest blade, which he stabbed into the dirt each time the dragonfly turned around. The sound was quiet, a faraway club striking something slowly growing soft. The woman's hands were spread over her chest, holding up the front of her dress, looking at him, smiling, looking at Rooney and grinning. Rooney scratched his hairless scalp as though he were trying to make up his mind about something. Don't do it, Jerry thought. For Christ's sakes, Rooney, don't do it. I used to be in show business, you know, F, he said, jamming the pole back into place. They called it vaudeville in my day. A whole bunch of different acts. Singers, dancers, guys with trained dogs, pigeons, magicians, comedians, women who thought they could do opera, stuff like that. I was a tap dancer, you know. I had this act where I put a board between two chairs and held a pig in my arms. I would tap from the floor to the board, hold the pig over my head, and sing Old McDonald. The boy stabbed harder. Did I tell you I was blindfolded? I was blindfolded. And I had one leg tied up behind me, like Long John Silver. I even wore a pirate's hat, you know, the kind with 3 corners and a big feather sticking out of it. Sunlight, clouds. Rooney pushed back the memory of his hair, a monstrous red thicket that made women's fingers itch and men's insides crawl away in shame for the thinning that made them comb their hair sideways. Sunlight. The woman slowly lowering her dress. Ephraim's hand rising, falling, the blade cutting the ground. Clouds. Slides flicking on and off a screen in a cavernous room where every breath was an echo, and every echo was a scream. Jerry closed his eyes against it, as he did every time it happened, knowing that when he opened them again, the flickering would happen so fast he would get dizzy. He would feel faint. He would lie down on the ground and wait for the hush of the stream to calm him, the setting of the sun to banish the others, the cry of the first night bird to bring him to his feet and send him home again. To the neighbors, to the whispering. And he thought, damn it, I'm getting too old for this crap. He held up a hand. His eyes opened, and there was only a cloud that rolled across the sun, rolling shadows and a wind over the surface of the stream into his face. He flinched as if slapped, but he didn't look away. Rooney, he said, you are a bastard. Rooney was indistinct, a shadow in shadow, little more than a glow of his eyes hovering above the ground like a pair of dragonflies watching. The woman lowered her hands even more, and the tops of her breasts were exposed to the twilight. Jerry didn't look away, not from the memory of them when they were soft and warm in his hands, not from the sight of them now, gleaming red. And you, he said, are a bitch. Dad, the boy said, not looking out, staring at the trench he had stabbed into the earth. Dad. She leaned over, folded nearly in half the top of her dress, now an apron in her lap, as she batted at the water, spraying it high, spraying it wide, her mouth open in silent laughter, the cool sound of the water, the distant sound of her voice. And she leaned back for a moment to brush the hair from her cheek, her fingers white enough to be bone. Dad. Jerry forced himself to look away, forced himself to pull the line in hand over shaking hand. The worm was gone. He put on another, and the point of the hook pricked the fat of his thumb, and the woman stared at the glint of blood from the far side of the stream, her eyes slightly wider, her lips wider still, and the tongue that lurked inside like the coil of a serpent. Damn, he muttered, sucking at the tiny wound. You have to be careful, the boy said, still stabbing. "I know," he answered, finishing the job and tossing the line in again. "Reminds me of the time—" "About Mom?" the boy asked. Rooney, shadow and light, laughed. "No, I wasn't going to say that." "She's so pretty," Ephraim whispered, the knife poised for another strike. "I wish I had hair like that. I wish I had a best friend I could go fishing with." "Hey," Jerry said, reaching for the boy's shoulder. "Hey! Aren't I your best friend?" Ephraim shook his head. "It's not the same." He looked downstream. "She's so pretty. So pretty." Rooney stepped into the sunlight and stepped back again, the bottle empty in his hand, his shirt in rags, his boots gone. "There was a time, Jerry said quickly, when I decided that being a cowboy wasn't the greatest life in the world. I mean, I couldn't stand the damn cows, and them Injuns were all the time—" The boy sighed and wiped the knife clean on his knee. "Bothering the herds and the hands, and I'll tell you, boy, it wasn't worth it. It really wasn't worth it until I decided to take the bit between my teeth. It was just before the trouble at Wounded Knee. You ever hear of Wounded Knee, son? Terrible thing. And I decided that if I was ever going to get my friend, the chief, out of there alive—" "Dad, please." "Shut up, kid," said Rooney, sinking to the ground, hands wrapped around his knees that gleamed white bone in the light and shadow sun. "I'd have to round up some of my buddies. They thought, you see, that Frank knew where Jesse really lived, that he wasn't really dead, and they were right. But aside from Frank, I was the only one who knew the truth." Perspiration on his brow, the woman sitting up, gleaming red, gleaming hate. "Dad, so I rode out of Abilene one morning at dawn, and I started east for Missouri. Terrible in those days, God, a man couldn't hardly find himself The knife rose, and Jerry watched it. The knife lowered a little at a time, and Jerry watched it. The knife sliced the air between them, snake fast and hissing. "I loved her," he said at last. "So did I, Dad." Rooney nodded, bad scalp dotted with shadows that crawled, one bare foot tapping on the ground, one hand languidly waving, but the flies didn't leave. "I don't think so," Rooney said. Jerry touched the bamboo pole. The woman rubbed her hands over her stomach and smeared the red to pink. The boy looked at Rooney and ran a hand through his tousled hair, stared at his reflection in the blade, and finally, for the first time, rose to his feet and stretched. "F," Jerry said, voice old, bones old, bamboo rod cracking, splitting in half with age. Sunlight, clouds. Rooney was gone. Rooney was laughing. "You know," the boy said, looking at the water, "I remember a time when we had elephants in the backyard. 4 of them, right? And the tiger, the lion too, I think. I used to feed them my cousins every Sunday, and every Monday the poor things would throw my cousins up. You used to get so mad it was funny. I mean, your face would go all funny, like you couldn't decide whether you were going to eat me or cut my throat. Ephraim!" The boy shrugged. The woman fastened her dress at the back, hiked up her skirts, and waded into the stream. Mouth turned in a smile, face aimed at the sky, one eye closed, the other eye missing. "Then there was the time," the boy said, leaning far over the bank to watch the fish follow the shadow of another cloud. "We went over to China and started digging because you wanted to be the first man in the world to come up in Oklahoma. We had such fights, do you remember? I said it wasn't Oklahoma at all. It was South Dakota, and you got so mad at me because I wouldn't listen to you that you put me in a rice paddy and tried to run me over with a water buffalo. And when that didn't work, you tried to run me over with a plow. Ephraim, damn it!" The boy shrugged. Jerry shut his eyes, clenched his teeth, clenched his fists, felt the beer grow warm and heavy in his stomach. "You don't do it right," he said quietly. "Sure I do." The woman moved downstream, in and out of black-rimmed sunlight. She didn't look around, she didn't wave goodbye, she didn't stop or miss a step when the wind attacked her from behind and tattered the rotted dress. "No," Jerry said, "tales aren't grotesque, they aren't cruel. They always have a little nut of truth somewhere deep inside of them. You ought to know that by now. Damn, you've heard enough of them. You ought to know." The boy looked over his shoulder. "I know." Jerry looked at the ground. Sunlight died. Clouds and twilight, dusk and wind. The bamboo pole and the empty cans of beer, and Jerry rubbed a hand too hard over his face, pressed too hard into his eyes, giving him a headache that made him wince, that made him groan. One of these days, he thought, I'm not going to come back. One of these days, I'm going to stay home. I'm going to stay in bed late. I'm going to eat crap for breakfast. I'm going to stop exercising. I'm going to stay up until dawn. I'm going to starve myself to death, and by Christ, nobody in this goddamn world is going to stop me. "Dad," the boy said, "you better get going. It's getting late." Jerry waited deliberately, then took his time getting his things together. And when he was done, pole over his shoulder, hat low over his eyes, he stepped across the sycamore's roots and stood beside his son. "The thing is," he said, "it's a matter of belief. You take the tale, and for the time you're telling it, you've got to believe it, or it won't be anything more than a dumb and stupid lie." The boy giggled, moonlight in darts of silver following the stream. The boy got the hiccups and laughed and held his stomach until Jerry threw the pole down and grabbed him, lifted him by the shoulders, and felt his face begin to twist into the mask he had worn before the house filled with dust. "Shut up," he said hoarsely. Ephraim only laughed the harder. "Shut up or I'll kill you!" The boy licked his lips once, looked once at each hand holding him off the ground, and said, "No, I bet you don't." Jerry dropped him, grabbed the pole, and started to leave the clearing. When he reached the path that would take him home, the anger left him just as abruptly as it had come, and he turned around. "I didn't do it, you know," he said plainly, not begging, waving his free hand toward the place where Rooney and the woman had been watching. The boy glanced up and down the stream as if looking for someone to come on them in a canoe, then flipped the knife in the air, caught it, sheathed it. Face hidden, colors gone, a silhouette of a ghost with moonlight for a mirror. "The thing is, Dad, like you said, you gotta have belief. You know what I mean? If you believe we're going to do this forever, then we will. If you believe we're never going to grow older, then we won't. If you believe you didn't do it, you didn't." "But I didn't," he insisted. Moonlight, clouds. The boy smiled and said, "I know."
Let me tell you a secret. It's the story of a little boy who lived out a fairy tale in the shadow of the silver screen and who was trapped in its memory forever. A Grim Tale by Peter Straub. The Juniper Tree.
It is a schoolyard in my Midwest of empty lots, waving green and brilliant with tiger lilies, of ugly new ranch houses set down in rows in glistening clay, of treeless avenues cooking in the sun. Our schoolyard is black asphalt. On June days, patches of the asphalt loosen and stick like gum to the soles of our high-top basketball shoes. Most of the playground is black, empty space from which heat radiates up like wavery images on the screen of a faulty television set. Tall wire mesh surrounds it. A new boy named Paul is standing beside me. Though it is now nearly the final month of the semester, Paul came to us only 6 weeks ago. Carroty-haired, pale-eyed, too shy to ask even the whereabouts of the lavatory. The lessons baffle him, and his southern accent is a fatal error of style. The popular students broadcast in hushed, giggling whispers the terrible news that Paul talks like a nigger. Their voices are almost awed. They are conscious of the enormity of what they are saying, of the enormity of its consequences. Paul is wearing a brilliant red shirt, too heavy, too enveloping for the weather. He and I stand in the shade at the rear of the school, before the cream-colored brick wall in which is placed at eye level a newly broken window of pebbly green glass reinforced with strands of copper wire. At our feet is a little scatter of green, edible-looking pebbles. The pebbles dig into the soles of our shoes, too hard to shatter against the softer asphalt. Paul is singing to me in his slow, lilting voice that he will never have friends in this school. I put my foot down on one of the green candy pebbles and feel it push up, hard as a bullet, against my foot. "Children are so cruel," Paul casually sings. I think of sliding the pebble of broken glass across my throat, slicing myself wide open to let death in. Paul did not return to school in the fall. His father, who had beaten a man to death down in Mississippi, had been arrested while leaving a movie theater near my house named the Orpheum Oriental. Paul's father had taken his family to see an Esther Williams movie co-starring Fernando Lamas, and when they came out, their mouths raw from salty popcorn, the baby's hands sticky with spilled Coca-Cola, the police were waiting for them. They were Mississippi people. And I think of Paul now, seated at a desk on a floor of an office building in Jackson, filled with men like him at desks. His tie perfectly knotted, a good shine on his cordovan shoes, a necessary but unconscious restraint in the set of his mouth. In those days, I used to spend whole days in the Orpheum Oriental. I was 7. I held within me the idea of a disappearance like Paul's, of never having to be seen again, of being an absence, a shadow, a place where something no longer visible used to be. Before I met that young old man, whose name was Frank or Stan or Jimmy, when I sat in the rapture of education before the movies at the Orpheum Oriental, I watched Alan Ladd and Richard Widmark and Glenn Ford and Dane Clark, Chicago Deadline, Martin and Lewis tangled up in the same parachute and at war with the Army, William Boyd and Roy Rogers. Open-mouthed, I drank down movies about spies and criminals, wanting the passionate and shadowy ones to fulfill themselves, to gorge themselves on what they needed. The feverish gaze of Richard Widmark, the anger of Alan Ladd, Barry Kroger's sneaky eyes, girlish and watchful, vivid, total elegance. When I was 7, my father walked into the bathroom and saw me looking at my face in the mirror. He slapped me, not with his whole strength, but hard, raging, instantly. "What do you think you're looking at?" His hand cocked and ready. "What do you think you see?" "Nothing," I said. "Nothing is right." A carpenter, he worked furiously, already defeated, and never had enough money. As if permanently beyond reach, some quantity of money existed that would have satisfied him. In the morning, he went to the job site hardened like cement, into anger he barely knew he had. Sometimes he brought men from the taverns home with him at night. They carried transparent bottles of Miller High Life and paper bags and set them down on the table with a bang that said, "Men are here." My mother, who had returned from her secretary's job a few hours earlier, fed my brothers and me, washed the dishes, and put the three of us to bed while the men shouted and laughed in the kitchen. He was considered an excellent carpenter. He worked slowly, patiently, and I see now that he spent whatever love he had in the rented garage that was his workshop. In his spare time, he listened to baseball games on the radio. He had professional but not personal vanity, and he thought that a face like mine should not be examined. Because I saw Jimmy in the mirror, I thought my father too had seen him. One Saturday, my mother took the twins and me on the ferry across Lake Michigan to Saginaw. The point of the journey was the journey. And at Saginaw, the boat docked for 20 minutes before wallowing back out into the lake and returning. With us were women like my mother, her friends, freed by the weekend from their jobs, some of them accompanied by men like my father, with their felt hats and baggy weekend trousers flaring over their weekend shoes. The women wore blood-bright lipstick that printed itself onto their cigarettes and smeared across their front teeth. They laughed a great deal and repeated the words that made them laugh. Hot dog, slippin' and slidin', opera singer. 30 minutes after departure, the men disappeared into the enclosed deck bar. The women, my mother among them, arranged deck chairs into a long oval tied together by laughter, attention, gossip. They waved their cigarettes in the air. My brothers raced around the deck, their shirts flapping, their hair glued to their skulls with sweat. When they squabbled, my mother ordered them into the empty deck chairs. I sat on the deck, leaning against the railings, quiet. If someone had asked me, "What do you want to do this afternoon? What do you want to do for the rest of your life?" I would have said, "I want to stay right here. I want to stay here forever." After a while, I stood up and left the women. I went across the deck and stepped through a hatch into the bar. Dark, deeply grained imitation wood covered the walls. The odors of beer and cigarettes and the sound of men's voices filled the enclosed space. About 20 men stood at the bar, talking and gesturing with half-filled glasses. Then one man broke away from the others with a flash of dirty blonde hair. I saw his shoulders move, and my scalp tingled, and my stomach froze. And I thought, Jimmy. But he turned all the way around, dipping his shoulders in some ecstasy of beer and male company, and I saw that he was a stranger. Not Jimmy, after all. I was thinking, someday, when I'm free, and when I am out of this body and in some city whose name I do not even know now, I will remember this from beginning to end, and then I will be free of it. The women floated over the empty lake, laughing out clouds of cigarette smoke. The men, too, as boisterous as the children on the sticky asphalt playground with its small green spray of glass like candy. In those days, I knew I was set apart from the rest of my family, an island between my parents and the twins. Those pairs that bracketed me slept in double beds in adjacent rooms at the back of the ground floor of the duplex, owned by the blind man who lived above us. My bed, a cot coveted by the twins, stood in their room. An invisible line of great authority divided my territory and possessions from theirs. This is what happened in the morning in our half of the duplex. My mother got up first. We heard her showering, heard drawers closing, the sounds of bowls and milk being set out on the table, the smell of bacon frying for my father, who banged on the door and called out my brothers' names. "Don't make me come in there now." The noisy, puppyish turmoil of my brothers getting out of bed. All three of us scrambling into the bathroom as soon as my father leaves it. The bathroom was steamy, heavy with the odor of shit and the more piercing, almost palpable smell of shaving, lather, and amputated whiskers. We all pee into the toilet at the same time. My mother frets and frets, pulling the twins into their clothes so that she can take them down the street to Mrs. Candy, who was given $5 every week for taking care of them. I'm supposed to be running back and forth on the playground in summer play school, supervised by 2 teenage girls who live a block away from us. I went to play school only twice. After I dress myself in clean underwear and socks and put on my everyday shirt and pants, I come into the kitchen while my father finishes his breakfast. He is eating strips of bacon and golden brown pieces of toast shiny with butter. A cigarette smolders in the ashtray before him. Everybody else has already left the house. My father and I can hear the blind man banging on the piano in his living room. I sit down before a bowl of cereal. My father looks at me, looks away. Angry at the blind man for banging at the piano this early in the morning, he is sweating already. His cheeks and forehead shine like the golden toast. My father glances at me, knowing he can postpone this no longer. He reaches wearily into his pocket and drops 2 quarters on the table. The high school girls charge 25 cents a day, and the other quarter is for my lunch. "Don't lose that money," he says as I take the coins. My father dumps coffee into his mouth, puts the cup and his plate into the crowded sink, looks at me again, pats his pockets for his keys, and says, "Close that door behind you." I tell him I will close the door. He picks up his gray toolbox, his black lunch pail, claps his hat on his head, and goes out, banging his toolbox against the door frame. It leaves a broad gray mark, like a smear left by the passing of some angry creature's hide. Then I am alone in the house. I go back to the bedroom, close the door, and push a chair beneath the knob, and read Black Hawk and Henry and Captain Marvel comic books until at last it is time to go to the theater. While I read, everything in the house seems alive and dangerous. I can hear the telephone in the hall rattling on its hook, the radio clicking as it tries to turn itself on and talk to me. The dishes stir and rattle in the sink. At these times, all objects, even the heavy chairs and sofa, become their true selves. Violent as the fire that fills the sky I cannot see and races through the secret ways and passages beneath the streets. At these times, other people vanish like smoke. When I pull the chair away from the door, the house immediately goes quiet, like a wild animal feigning sleep. Everything inside and out slips cunningly back into place. The fires bank, men and women reappear on the sidewalks. I must open the door, and I do. I walk swiftly through the kitchen and the living room to the front door, knowing that if I look too carefully at any one thing, I will wake it up again. My mouth is so dry, my tongue feels fat. "I'm leaving," I say to no one. Everything in the house hears me. The quarter goes through the slot at the bottom of the window. The ticket leaps from its slot. For a long time before Jimmy, I thought that unless you kept your stub unfolded and safe in the shirt pocket, the usher could rush down the aisle in the middle of the movie, seize you, and throw you out. So into the pocket it goes, and I slip through the big doors into the cool, cross the lobby, and pass through the swinging door with a porthole window. Most of the regular daytime patrons of the Orpheum Oriental sit in the same seats every day. I am one of those who comes here every day. A small, talkative gathering of bums sits far to the right of the theater, in the rows beneath the sconces fastened like bronze torches to the walls. The bums choose their seats so that they can examine their bits of paper, their documents, and show them to each other during the movie. Always on their minds is the possibility that they might have lost one of these documents, and they frequently consult the tattered envelopes in which they are kept. I take the end seat, left side of the central block of seats just before the broad, horizontal middle aisle. There I can stretch out. At other times, I sit in the middle of the last row, or the first. Sometimes, when the balcony is open, I go up and sit in its first row. From the first row of the balcony, seeing a movie is like being a bird and flying down into the movie from above. To be alone in the theater is delicious. The curtains hang heavy, red, anticipatory. The mock torches glow on the walls. Swirls of gilt wind through the red paint. On days when I sit near the wall, I reach out toward the red, which seems warm and soft, and find my fingers resting on a chill dampness. The carpet of the Orpheum Oriental must once have been a bottomless rich brown. Now it is a dark non-color mottled with the pink and gray smears like melted Band-Aids of chewing gum. From about a third of the seats, dirty gray wool foams from slashes in the worn plush. On an ideal day, I sit through a cartoon, a travelogue, a sequence of previews, a movie, another cartoon, and another movie before anyone else enters the theater. The whole cycle is as satisfying as a meal. On other mornings, old women in odd hats and young women wearing scarves on their rollers, a few teenage couples, are scattered throughout the theater when I come in. None of these people ever pays any attention to anything but the screen, and, in the case of teenagers, each other. Once, a man in his early 20s, hair like a haystack, sat up in the wide middle aisle when I took my seat. He groaned. Rusty-looking dried blood was spattered all over his chin and his dirty white shirt. He groaned again, and then got to his hands and knees. The carpet beneath him was spotted with what looked like 1,000 red dots. The young man stumbled to his feet and began reeling up the aisle. A bright, depthless pane of sunlight surrounded him before he vanished into it. At the beginning of July, I told my mother that the high school girls had increased the hours of the play school because I wanted to be sure of seeing both features twice before I had to go home. After that, I could learn the rhythms of the theater itself, which did not impress themselves on me all at once, but revealed themselves gradually, so that by the middle of the first week, I knew when the bums would begin to move toward the seats beneath the sconces. They usually arrived on Tuesdays and Fridays shortly after 11 o'clock when the liquor store down the block opened up to provide them with pints and half-pints that nourished them. By the end of the second week, I knew when the ushers left the interior of the theater to sit on padded benches in the lobby and light up their Luckies and Chesterfields. By the end of the third week, I felt like the merest part of a great orderly machine. Before the beginning of the second showing of Beautiful Hawaii or Curiosities Down Under, I went out to the counter and with my second quarter purchased a box of popcorn or a packet of Good and Plenty candy. In a movie theater, nothing is random except the customers and the hitches in the machine. Film strips break and the lights fail, the projectionist gets drunk or falls asleep, and the screen presents a blank yellow face to the stomping, whistling audience. These inconsistencies are summer squalls, forgotten as soon as they have ended. The occasion for the lights, the projectionist, the boxes of popcorn and packets of candy, the movies enlarged when seen over and over. The truth gradually came to me that this deepening and widening out, this enlarging, was why movies were shown over and over all day long. The machine revealed itself most surely in the exact, limpid repetition of the actors' words and gestures as they moved through the story. When Alan Ladd asked Blackie Francho, the dying gangster, "Who did it, Blackie?" his voice widened like a river, grew sandier with an almost unconcealed tenderness I had to learn to hear. The voice within the speaking voice. Chicago Deadline was the exploration of a newspaper reporter named Ed Adams, Alan Ladd, of the tragedy of a mysterious young woman, Rosita Gendreau, who had died alone of tuberculosis in a shabby hotel room. The reporter soon learns that she had many names, many identities. She had been in love with an architect, a gangster, a crippled professor, a boxer, a millionaire, and had given a different facet of her being to each of them. Far too predictably, the adult me complains. The obsessed Ed falls in love with Rosita. When I was 7, little was predictable. I had not yet seen Laura, and I saw a man driven by the need to understand, which became identical to the need to protect. Rosita Gendreau was the embodiment of memory, which was mystery. Through the sequences of her identities, the various selves, shown to the brother, boxer, millionaire, gangster, all the others, her memory kept her whole. I saw twice a day for 2 weeks, before and during Jimmy, the machine, deep within the machine. Love and memory were the same. Both love and memory accommodated us to death. I did not understand this, but I saw it. The reporter, Alan Ladd, with his dirty blonde hair, his perfect jawline, and the brilliant, wounded smile, gave her life by making her memory his own. I think you're the only one who ever understood her, Arthur Kennedy, Rosita's brother, tells Alan Ladd. Most of the world demands the kick of sensation. Most of the world must gather and spend money, hunt for easier and more temporary forms of love, must feed itself, sell newspapers, destroy the enemy's plots with plots of its own. I don't know what you want, Ed Adams says to the editor of the journal. You got 2 murders. And a mystery woman, I say along with him. His voice is tough and detached, the voice of a wounded man acting. The man beside me laughs. Unlike his normal voice, his laughter is breathless and high-pitched. It is the second showing today of Chicago Deadline, early afternoon, after the next showing of At War with the Army. I will have to walk up the aisle and out of the theater. It will be 20 minutes to 5, and the sun will still burn high over the cream-colored buildings across wide, empty Sherman Boulevard. I met the man, or he met me, at the candy counter. He was at first only a tall presence, blond, dressed in dark clothing. I cared nothing for him. He did not matter. He was vague even when he spoke. Good popcorn. I looked up at him, narrow blue eyes, bad teeth smiling at me, stubble on his face. I looked away, and the uniformed man behind the counter handed me popcorn. Good for you. I mean, good stuff in popcorn comes right out of the ground. Grows on big plants, tall as I am, just like other corn. You know that? When I said nothing, he laughed and spoke to the man behind the counter. He didn't know that. The kid thought popcorn grew inside poppers. The counterman turned away. You come here a lot? The man asked me. I put a few kernels of popcorn in my mouth and turned toward him. He was showing me his bad teeth. You do, he said. You come here a lot. I nodded. Every day? I nodded again. And we tell little fibs at home about what we've been doing all day, don't we? He asked, and pursed his lips and raised his eyes like a comic butler in a movie. Then his mood shifted, and everything about him became serious. He was looking at me, but he did not see me. You got a favorite actor? I got a favorite actor. Alan Ladd. And I saw. Both saw and understood that he thought he looked like Alan Ladd. He did, too, at least a little bit. When I saw the resemblance, he seemed like a different person, more glamorous. Glamour surrounded him as though he were acting, impersonating a shabby young man with stained, irregular teeth. The name's Frank, he said, and stuck out his hand. Shake? I took his hand. "Real good popcorn," he said, and stuck his hand into the box. "Want to hear a secret?" A secret. I was born twice. The first time I died. It was on an army base. Everybody told me I should have joined the Navy, and everybody was right. So I said to myself, get born somewhere else. Hey, the Army's not for everybody, you know? He grinned down at me. Now I told you my secret. Let's go in. I'll sit with you. Everybody needs company, and I like you. You look like a good kid. He followed me back to my seat and sat down beside me. When I quoted the lines along with the actors, he laughed. Then he leaned toward me and said, he leaned toward me, breathing sour wine over me, and took... No. I was just kidding out there, he said. Frank ain't my real name. Well, it was my name before. See, Frank used to be my name for a while, but now my good friends call me Stan. I like that. Stanley the Steamer. Big Stan. Stan the man. See? It works real good. You'll never be a carpenter, he told me. You'll never be anything like that because you got that look. I used to have that look, okay? So I know. I know about you just by looking at you. He said he'd been a clerk at Sears. After that, he'd worked as a custodian for a couple of apartment buildings owned by a guy who used to be a friend of his but was no longer. Then he'd been a janitor at the high school where my grade school sent its graduates. Good old booze got me fired, story of my life, he said. Tight-ass bitches caught me drinking down in the basement, in a room I used there, and threw me out without a fare thee well. Hey, that was my room, my place. The best things in the world can do the worst things to you. You'll find that out someday. And when you go to that school, I hope you'll remember what they done to me there. These days he was resting. He hung around. He went to the movies. He said, you got something special in you. Guys like me, we're funny, we can tell. We sat together through the second feature, Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis, comfortable and laughing. Those guys are bigger bums than us, he said. I thought of Paul, backed up against the school in his enveloping red shirt, imprisoned within his inability to be like anyone around him. You coming back tomorrow? If I get here, I'll check around for you. Hey, trust me. I know who you are. You know that little thing you pee with? Leaning sideways and whispering into my ear. That's the best thing a man's got. Trust me. The big Providential Park near our house, 2 streets past the Orpheum Oriental, is separated into 3 different areas. Nearest the wide iron gates on Sherman Boulevard, through which we enter, was a wading pool divided by a low green hedge from a playground, with a climbing frame, swings, and a row of seesaws. When I was a child of 2 and 3, I splashed in the warm pool and clung to the chains of the swings, making myself go higher and higher, terror and joy and grim duty so woven together that no one could pull them apart. Beyond the children's pool and playground was the zoo. My mother walked my brothers and me to the playground and wading pool and sat smoking on a bench while we played. Both of my parents took us to the zoo. An elephant extended his trunk to my father's palm and delicately lipped the peanuts toward his maw. The giraffe stretched towards the constantly diminishing supply of leaves ever fewer and higher above his cage. The lions drowsed on amputated branches and paced behind the bars, staring out not at what was there but at the long grassy plains imprinted on their memories. I knew the lions had the power not to see us, to look straight through us to Africa. But when they saw you instead of Africa, they looked right into your bones. They saw the blood traveling through your body. The lions were golden brown, patient, green-eyed. They recognized me and could read thoughts. The lions neither liked nor disliked me. They did not miss me during their long weekdays, but they took me into the circle of known beings. You shouldn't have looked at me like that, June Havoc, Leona tells Ed Adams. She does not mean it, not at all. Past the zoo and across a narrow park road, down which khaki-clothed park attendants push barrows heavy with flowers, stood a wide, unexpected lawn bordered with flower beds and tall elms. Open space hidden like a secret between the caged animals and the elm trees. Only my father brought me to this section of the park. Here, he tried to make a baseball player of me. "Get that bat off your shoulders," he said. "For God's sakes, will you try to hit the ball anyhow?" When I fail once again to swing at his slow, perfect pitch, he spins around, raises his arm, and theatrically asks everyone in sight, "Whose kid is this, anyway? Can you answer me that?" He has never asked me about the play school I am supposed to be attending, and I have never told him about the Orpheum Oriental. I will never come any closer to talking to him than now, for Stanley the steamer, has told me things that cannot be true, that must be inventions and fables, part of the world of children wandering lost in the forest, of talking cats and silver boots filled with blood. In this world, dismembered children buried beneath juniper trees can rise and speak, made whole once again. Fables boil with underground explosions and hidden fires, and for this reason memory rejects them, thrusts them out of its sight, and they must be repeated over and over. I cannot remember Stan's face, cannot even be sure I remember what he said. Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis are bums like us. I am certain of only one thing. Tomorrow, I am again going to see my newest, scariest, and most interesting friend. When I was your age, my father says, I had my heart set on playing pro ball when I grew up. And you're too damned scared or lazy to even take the bat off your shoulder. Christ, I can't stand looking at you anymore. He turns around and begins to move quickly toward the narrow park road and the zoo, going home, and I run after him. I retrieve the softball when he tosses it into the bushes. "What the hell do you think you're going to do when you grow up?" my father asks, his eyes still fixed ahead of him. "I wonder what you think life is all about. I wouldn't give you a job. I wouldn't trust you around carpenter tools. I wouldn't trust you to blow your nose right. To tell you the truth, I wonder if the hospital mixed up the goddamn babies." I follow him, dragging the bat with one hand and the other cradling the softball in the pouch of my mitt. At dinner, my mother asks if summer play school is fun, and I say yes. I have already taken from my father's dresser drawer what Stan asked me to get for him, and it burns in my pocket as if it were a light. I want to ask, is it actually true and not a story? Does the worst thing always have to be the true thing? Of course, I cannot ask this. My father does not know about worst things. He sees what he wants to see, or he tries so hard he thinks he does see it. I guess he'll hit the long ball someday. The boy just needs more work on his swing. He tries to smile at me, a boy who will someday learn to hit a long ball. The knife is upended in his fist. He is about to smear a pat of butter on his steak. He does not see me at all. My father is not a lion. He cannot make the switch to seeing what is really there in front of him. Late at night, Alan Ladd knelt beside my bed. He was wearing a neat gray suit, and his breath smelled like cloves. "You okay, son?" I nodded. "I just wanted to tell you that I like seeing you out there every day. That means a lot to me." "Do you remember what I was telling you about?" And I knew it was true. He had said those things, and he would repeat them like a fairy tale, and the world was going to change because it would be seen through changed eyes. I felt sick, trapped in the theater, as if in a cage. "You think about what I told you?" "Sure," I said. "That's good. Hey, you know what? I feel like changing seats." "You want to change seats too?" "Where to?" He tilted his head back, and I knew he wanted to move to the last row. "Come on. I want to show you something." We changed seats. For a long time, we sat watching the movie from the last row, nearly alone in the theater. Just after 11, 3 of the bums filed in and proceeded to their customary seats on the side of the theater. A rumpled graybeard I had seen many times before. A fat man with a stubby, squashed face, also familiar, and one of the shaggy, wild-looking young men who hung around the bums until they became indistinguishable from them. They began passing a flat brown bottle back and forth. After a second, I remembered the young man. I had surprised him awake one morning, passed out and spattered with blood in the middle aisle. Then I wondered if Stan was not the young man I had surprised that morning. They looked as alike as twins, though I knew they were not. "Want a sip?" Stan said, showing me his own pint bottle. "Do you good." Bravely, feeling privileged and adult, I took the bottle of Thunderbird and raised it to my mouth. I wanted to like it, to share the pleasure of it with Stan, but it tasted horrible, like garbage, and the little bit I swallowed burned all the way down my throat. I made a face, and he said, "This stuff's really not so bad. Only one thing in the world can make you feel better than this stuff." He placed his hand on my thigh and squeezed. "I'm giving you a head start, you know? Just because I liked you the first time I saw you." And he leaned over and he stared at me. "You believe me? You believe the things I tell you?" I said I guessed so. "I got proof. I'll show you it's true. Want to see my proof?" When I said nothing, Stan leaned closer to me, inundating me with the stench of Thunderbird. "You know that little thing you pee with? Remember how I told you it gets real big when you're about 13? Remember I told you about how incredible it feels? Well, you have to trust Stan now, because Stan's going to trust you." He put his face right beside my ear. "Then I'll tell you another secret." He lifted his hand from my thigh and closed it around mine and pulled my hand down to his crotch. "Feel anything?" I nodded, but I could not have described what I felt any more than a blind man could describe the elephant. Stan smiled tightly and tugged at his zipper in a way that I could tell was nervous. He reached inside his pants, fumbled, and pulled out a thick, pale club that looked like nothing human. I was so frightened, I thought I would throw up. And I looked back at the screen. Invisible chains held me to my seat. "See? Now you understand me? Then he noticed that I was not looking at him. "Kid, look." I said, "Look. It's not going to hurt you." I could not look down at him. I saw nothing. "Come on. Touch it. See what it feels like." I shook my head. "Let me tell you something. I like you a lot. I think the two of us are friends. This thing we're doing, it's unusual to you because this is the first time. But people do this all the time. Your mommy and daddy do it all the time. But they just don't tell you about it. We're pals, aren't we?" I nodded dumbly. On the screen, Barry Kroger was telling Alan Ladd, "Drop it. Forget it. She's poison." "Well, this is what friends do when they really like each other. Like your mommy and daddy. Look at this thing, will you? Come on." Did Mommy and Daddy like each other? He squeezed my shoulder, and I looked. Now the thing had folded up into itself and was drooping sideways against the fabric of his trousers. Almost as soon as I looked at it, it twitched and began to push itself out like the slide of a trombone. "There," he said. "It likes you. You got him going. Tell me you like him too." Terror would not let me speak. My brains had turned to powder. "I know what. Let's call him Jimmy. We'll say his name's Jimmy. Now that you've been introduced, say hi to Jimmy." "Hi, Jimmy," I said, and despite my terror could not keep myself from giggling. "Go on now. Touch him." I slowly extended my hand and put the tips of my fingers on Jimmy. "Pet him. Jimmy wants you to pet him." I tapped my fingertips against Jimmy 2 or 3 times, and he twitched up another few degrees, as rigid as a surfboard. "Slide your fingers up and down on him." If I run, I thought, he'll catch me and kill me. If I don't do what he says, he'll kill me. I rubbed my fingertips back and forth, moving the thin skin over the veins. Can't you imagine Jimmy going in a woman? Now you can see what you'll be like when you're a man. Keep on, but hold him with your whole hand, and give me what I ask you for. I immediately took my hand from Jimmy and pulled my father's clean white handkerchief from my back pocket. He took the handkerchief with his left hand and with his right guided mine back to Jimmy. "You're doing really great," he whispered. In my hand, Jimmy felt warm and slightly gummy. I could not join my fingers around its width. My head was buzzing. "Is Jimmy your secret?" I was able to say. "My secret comes later." "Can I stop now?" "I'll cut you into little pieces if you do," he said, and when I froze, he stroked my hair and whispered, "Hey, can't you tell when a guy's kidding around? I'm really happy with you right now. You're the best kid in the world. You'd want this too, if you knew how good it felt." After what seemed an endless time, while Alan Ladd was climbing out of a taxicab, Stan abruptly arched his back, grimaced, and whispered, "Look!" His entire body jerked, and too startled to let go, I held Jimmy and watched thick, ivory-colored milk spurt and drool almost unendingly into the handkerchief. An odor utterly foreign, but as familiar as the toilet or the lakeshore rose from the thick milk. Stan sighed, folded the handkerchief, and pushed the softening Jimmy back into his trousers. He leaned over and kissed the top of my head. I think I nearly fainted. I felt lightly, pointlessly dead. I could still feel him pulsing in my palm and fingers. When it was time for me to go home, he told me his secret. His own real name was Jimmy, not Stan. He'd been saving his real name until he knew he could trust me. "Tomorrow," he said, touching my cheek with his fingers. "We'll see each other again tomorrow. But you don't have anything to worry about. I trust you enough to give you my real name. You trusted me not to hurt you, and I didn't. We have to trust each other not to say anything about this, or both you and me'll be in a lot of trouble." "I won't say anything," I said. "I love you. I love you. Yes, I do. Now we're a secret," he said, folding the handkerchief into quarters and putting it back in my pocket. "A lot of love has to be secret, especially when a boy and a man are getting to know each other and learning how to make each other happy and be good, loving friends. Not many people can understand that, so the friendship has to be protected. When you walk out of here," he said, "you have to forget that this happened. Otherwise, people will try to hurt us both." Afterwards, I remember only the confusion of Chicago Deadline, how the story had abruptly surged forward, skipping over whole characters and entire scenes, how for long stretches the actors had moved their lips without speaking. I could see Alan Ladd stepping out of the taxicab, looking straight through the screen into my eyes, knowing me. My mother said that I looked pale, and my father said that I didn't get enough exercise. The twins looked up from their plates, then went back to spooning macaroni and cheese into their mouths. "Were you ever in Chicago?" I asked my father. "Who asked? What was it to me?" "Did you ever meet a movie actor?" I asked. And he said, "This kid must have a fever." The twins giggled. Alan Ladd and Donna Reed came into my bedroom together late that night, moving with brisk, cool theatricality, and kneeled down beside my cot. They smiled at me. Their voices were very soothing. "I saw you missed a few things today," Alan said. "Nothing to worry about. I'll take care of you." "I know," I said. "I'm your #1 fan." Then the door cracked open, and my mother put her head inside the room. Alan and Donna smiled and stood up to let her pass between them and the cot. I missed them the second they stepped back. "Still awake?" I nodded. "Are you feeling all right, honey?" I nodded again, afraid that Alan and Donna would leave if she stayed too long. "I have a surprise for you," she said. "The Saturday after this, I am taking you and the twins all the way across Lake Michigan on the ferry. There's a whole bunch of us. It'll be a lot of fun." "Good. That's nice. I like that." "I thought about you all last night and all this morning." When I came into the lobby, he was leaning forward on one of the padded benches where the ushers sat and smoked, his elbows on his knees and his chin in his hand, watching the door. The metal tip of a flat bottle protruded from his side pocket. Beside him was a package rolled up in brown paper. He winked at me, jerked his head toward the door into the theater, stood up, and went inside in an elaborate charade of not being with me. I knew he would be just inside the door, sitting in the middle of the last row, waiting for me. I gave my ticket to the bored usher, who tore it in half and handed over the stub. I knew exactly what had happened yesterday, just as if I had never forgotten any of it, and my insides began shaking. All the colors of the lobby, the red and the shabby gilt, seemed much brighter than I had remembered them. I could smell the popcorn in the case and the oily butter heating in the machine. My legs moved me over a mile of sizzling brown carpet and past the candy counter. Jimmy's hair gleamed in the empty, darkening theater. When I took the seat next to him, he ruffled my hair and grinned down and said that he'd been thinking about me all night and all morning. The package in the brown paper was a sandwich he'd brought for my lunch. A kid had to eat more than popcorn. The lights went all the way down as the series of curtains opened over the screen. Loud music, beginning in the middle of a note, suddenly jumped from the speakers, and the Tom and Jerry cartoon bulldozing began. When I leaned back, Jimmy put his arm around me. I felt sweaty and cold at the same time, and my insides were still shaking. I suddenly realized that a part of me was glad to be in this place, and I shocked myself with the knowledge that all morning I had been looking forward to this moment as much as I had been dreading it. "You want your sandwich now? It's liver sausage, because that's my personal favorite." I said no thanks. I'd wait until the first movie was over. "Okay," he said, "just as long as you eat it." Then he said, "Look at me." His face was right above mine, and he looked like Alan Ladd's twin brother. "You have to know something. You're the best kid I ever met. Ever." The man squeezed me up against his chest and into a dizzying funk of sweat and dirt and wine, along with a trace of that other, more animal odor that had come from him yesterday. Then he released me. "You want me to play with your little Jimmy today?" "No." "Too small, anyhow," he said with a laugh. He was in perfect good humor. "Bet you wished it was the same size as mine." That wish terrified me. I shook my head. "Today, we're just going to watch the movies together," he said. "I'm not greedy." Except for when one of the ushers came up the aisle, we sat like that all day, his arm around my shoulders, the back of my neck resting in the hollow of his elbow. When the credits for At War with the Army rolled up the screen, I felt as though I'd fallen asleep and missed everything. I couldn't believe that it was time to go home. Jimmy tightened his arm around me and in a voice full of amusement said, "Touch me." I looked up into his face. "Go on," he said. "I want you to do that little thing for me." I prodded his fly with my index finger. Jimmy wobbled under the pressure of my fingers, seeming as long as my arm, and for a second of absolute wretchedness, I saw the other children running up and down the school playground behind the girls from the next block. "Go on," he said. "Trust me," he said, investing Jimmy with an identity more concentrated, more focused than his own. Jimmy wanted to talk, to speak his piece, was hungry, was dying for a kiss. All these words meant the same thing. Trust me. I trust you, so you trust me. Have I ever hurt you? No. Didn't I give you a sandwich? Yes. Didn't I love you? You know I won't tell your parents what you do. As long as you keep coming here, I won't tell your parents anything because I won't have to. See? You love me too, don't you? There. See how much I love you? I dreamed that I lived underground in a wooden room. I dreamed that my parents roamed the upper world, calling out my name and weeping because the animals had captured and eaten me. I dreamed that I was buried beneath a juniper tree, and the cut-off pieces of my body called out to each other and wept because they were separate. I dreamed that I ran down a dark forest path toward my parents, and when I finally reached the small clearing where they sat before a bright fire, my mother was Donna and Alan was my father. I dreamed that I could remember everything that was happening to me, every second of it, and that when the teacher called on me in class, when my mother came into my room at night, when the policeman went past me as I walked down Sherman Boulevard, I had to spill it out. But when I tried to speak, I couldn't remember what it was that I remembered. Only that there was something to remember. And so I walked again and again toward my beautiful parents in the clearing, repeating myself like a fable, like the jokes of the women on the ferry. Don't I love you? Don't I show you? Can't you tell that I love you? Yes. Don't you? Can't you love me too? He stares at me as I stare at the movie. He could see me the way I could see him, with his eyes closed. He has me memorized. He has stroked my hair, my face, my body into his memory, stroke after stroke, stealing me from myself. Eventually he took me in his mouth, and his mouth memorized me too. And I knew he had wanted me to place my hands on that dirty blonde head resting so hugely in my lap. But I could not touch his head. I thought, I have already forgotten this. I want to die. I am dead already. Only death can make this not have happened. When you grow up, I bet you'll be in the movies, and I'll be your #1 fan. By the weekend, those days at the Orpheum Oriental seemed to have been spent underwater or underground. The spiny anteater, the lyrebird, the kangaroo, the Tasmanian devil, the nun bat, and the frilled lizard were creatures found only in Australia. Australia was the world's smallest continent, its largest island. It was cut off from the Earth's great land masses. Beautiful girls with blonde hair strutted across Australian beaches, and Australian Christmases were hot and sun-baked. Everybody went outside and waved at the camera, exchanging presents from lawn chairs. The middle of Australia, its heart and gut, was a desert. Australian boys excelled at sports. Tomcat loved Jerry Mouse, though he plotted again and again to murder him, and Jerry Mouse loved Tomcat, though to save his life he had to run so fast he burned a track through the carpet. Jimmy loved me, and he would be gone someday, and then I would miss him a lot. Wouldn't I? Say you'll miss me. I'll miss... I think I'd go crazy without you. And when you're all grown up, will you remember me? Each time I walked back past the usher, tearing in half the tickets of people just entering, handing them the stubs, every time I pushed open the door and walked out into the heat-filled sidewalk of Sherman Boulevard and saw the sun on the buildings across the street, I lost my hold on what had happened inside the darkness of the theater. I didn't know what I wanted. I had 2 murders and a... My right hand felt as though I had been holding a smaller child's sticky hand very tightly between my palm and fingers. If I lived in Australia, I would have blonde hair like Alan Ladd and run forever across tan beaches on Christmas Day. I walked through high school in my sleep, reading novels, daydreaming in classes I did not like, but earning spuriously good grades. In the middle of my senior year, Brown University gave me a full scholarship. 2 years later, I amazed and disappointed my old teachers and my parents' friends by dropping out of school shortly before I would have failed all my classes but English and history, in which I was getting A's. I was certain that no one could teach anyone else how to write. I knew exactly what I was going to do, and all I'd miss of college was the social life. For 5 years, I lived inexpensively in Providence, supporting myself by stacking books in the school library and by petty thievery. I wrote when I was not working or listening to the local bands. Then I destroyed what I had written and wrote it again. In this way, I saw myself to the end of a novel, like walking through a park one way and then walking backward and forward through the same park over and over until every nick on every swing, every tawny hair on every lion's hide had been witnessed and made to gleam or allowed to sink back into the importunate field of details from which it had been lifted. When this novel was rejected by the publishers to whom I sent it, I moved to New York City and began another novel while I rewrote the first all over again at night. During this period, an almost impersonal happiness, like the happiness of a stranger, lay beneath everything I did. I wrapped parcels of books at the Strand bookstore. For a short time, no more than a few months, I lived on shredded wheat and peanut butter. When my first book was accepted, I moved from a single room on the Lower East Side into another, larger single room, a studio apartment, on 9th Avenue in Chelsea, where I continue to live. My apartment is just large enough for my wooden desk, a convertible couch, 2 large, crowded bookshelves, a shelf of stereo equipment, and dozens of cardboard boxes of records. In this apartment, everything has its place and is in it. My parents have never been to this enclosed, tidy space, though I speak to my father on the phone every 2 or 3 months. In the past 10 years, I have returned to the city where I grew up only once, to visit my mother in the hospital after her stroke. During the 4 days that I stayed in my father's house, I slept in my old room, my father upstairs. After the blind man's death, my father bought the duplex. On my first night home, he told me that we were both successes. Now, when we speak on the telephone, he tells me of the fortunes of the local baseball and basketball teams and respectfully inquires about my progress on the new book. I think, this is not my father. This is not the same man. My old cot disappeared long ago, and late at night I lay on the twins' double bed. Like the house as a whole, like everything in my old neighborhood, the bedroom was larger than I remembered it. I brushed the wallpaper with my fingers, then looked up at the ceiling. The image of 2 men tangled in the ropes of the same parachute, comically berating each other as they fell, came to me, and I wondered if the image had a place in the novel I was writing, or if it was a gift from the as-yet unseen novel that would follow it. I could hear the floor creak as my father paced upstairs in the blind man's former territory. My inner weather changed, and I began brooding about My Levitt, whom 15 years earlier at Brown I had known as My Chung. Divorced and an editor at a paperback firm, she had called to congratulate me after my second novel was favorably reviewed in the Times. And on this slim but well-intentioned foundation, we began to construct a long and troubled love affair. Back in the surroundings of my childhood, I felt profoundly uneasy having spent the day beside my mother's hospital bed without knowing if she understood or even recognized me. And I thought of My with sudden longing. I wanted her in my arms. I yearned for my purposeful, orderly, dreaming adult life in New York. I wanted to call My, but it was past midnight in the Midwest, an hour later in New York, and My, no owl, would have gone to bed hours earlier. Then I remembered my mother lying stricken in the narrow hospital bed and suffering a spasm of guilt for thinking about my lover. For a deluded moment, I imagined that it was my duty to move back into the house and see if I could bring my mother back to life, while I did what I could for my retired father, At that moment I remembered, as I often did, an orange-haired boy enveloped in a red wool shirt. Sweat poured from my forehead, my chest. Then a terrifying thing happened to me. I tried to get out of bed, to go to the bathroom, and found that I could not move. My arms and legs were cast in cement. They were lifeless and would not move. I thought that I was having a stroke, like my mother. I could not even cry out. My throat, too, was paralyzed. I strained to push myself off the narrow bed and smelled that someone very near, someone just out of sight or around the corner, was making popcorn and heating butter. Another wave of sweat gouted out of my inert body, turning the sheet and the pillowcase slick and cold. I saw, as if I were writing it, my 7-year-old self hesitating before the entrance of a theater a few blocks from this house. Hot, flat, yellow sunlight fell over everything, cooking the life from the wide boulevard. I saw myself turn away, felt my stomach churn with the smoke of underground fires, saw myself begin to run. Vomit backed up in my throat. My arms and legs convulsed. I fell out of the bed and managed to crawl out of the room and down the hall to throw up in the toilet behind the closed door of the bathroom. My age, as I write these words, is 43. I have written 5 novels over a period of nearly 20 years. Only 5. Each of them more difficult, harder to write than the one before. To maintain this hobbled pace of a novel every 4 years, I must sit at my desk at least 6 hours every day. I must consume hundreds of boxes of typing paper, scores of yellow legal pads, forests of pencils, miles of black ribbon. It is a fierce, voracious activity. Every sentence must be tested 3 or 4 ways, made to clear fences like a horse. The purpose of every sentence is to be an arrow into the secret center of the book. To find my way into the secret center, I must hold the entire book, every detail and rhythm in my memory. This comprehensive act of memory is the most crucial task of my life. My books get flattering reviews, which usually seem to describe other more linear novels, and they win occasional awards. I am one of those writers whose advances are funded by the torrents of money spun off by bestsellers. Lately, I've had the impression that the general perception of me, to the extent that such a thing exists, is that of a hermetic painter inscribing hundreds of tiny, grotesque, fantastical details over every inch of a large canvas. My books are unfashionably long. I teach writing at various colleges, give occasional lectures, am modestly enriched by grants. This is enough, more than enough. Now and then I'm both dismayed and amused to discover that a young writer I have met at a pen reception for a workshop regards my life with envy. Envy misses the point completely. If you were going to give me one piece of advice, a young woman at the conference asked me, I mean real advice, not just the obvious stuff about keeping on writing, what would it be? What would you tell me to do? I won't tell you, but I'll write it out, I said, and picked up one of the conference flyers and printed a few words on its back. Don't read this until you're out of the room, I said, and watched while she folded the flyer into her bag. What I had printed on the back of the flyer was, go to a lot of movies. On Sunday, after the ferry trip, I could not hit a single ball in the park. My eyes kept closing, and as soon as my eyelids came down, visions started up like movies. Quick, automatic dreams. My arms seemed too heavy to lift. After I'd trudged home behind my dispirited father, I collapsed on the sofa and slept straight through to dinner. In a dream, a spacious box confined me, and I drew colored pictures of elm trees, the sun, wide fields, mountains, and rivers on its walls. At dinner, loud noises, never scarce, around the twins made me jump. "That kid's not right, I swear to you," my father said. When my mother asked if I wanted to go to play school on Monday, my stomach closed up like a fist. "I have to," I said. "I'm really fine. I have to go." Sentences rolled from my mouth meaning nothing, or meaning the wrong thing. For a moment of confusion, I thought I really was going to the playground, and saw black asphalt, deep as a field, where a few children, diminished by perspective, clustered at the far end. I went right to bed after dinner. My mother pulled down the shades, turned off the light, and finally left me alone. From above came the sound, like a beast's approximation of music, of random notes struck on a piano. I knew only that I was scared, not why. The next day I had to go to a certain place, but I could not think where until my fingers recalled the velvety plush of the end seat on the middle aisle. Then black and white images, full of intentional menace, came to me from the previews I had seen for 2 weeks. The Hitchhiker, starring Edmund O'Brien. The Spiny Anteater and the Nun Bat were animals found only in Australia. I longed for Alan Ladd, Ed Adams, to walk into the room with his reporter's notebook and pencil, and knew that I had something to remember without knowing what it was. After a long time, the twins cascaded into the bedroom undressed, put on pajamas, brushed their teeth. The front door slammed. My father had gone out to the taverns. In the kitchen, my mother ironed shirts and talked to herself in a familiar, rancorous voice. The twins went to sleep. I heard my mother put away the ironing board and walk down the hall to the living room. I saw Ed Adams calmly walk up and down the sidewalk outside our house, as handsome as a god in his neat great suit. Ed went all the way to the end of the block, put a cigarette in his mouth, and leaned into a sudden round flare of brightness before exhaling smoke and walking away. I knew I had fallen asleep only when the front door slammed for the second time that night and woke me up. In the morning, my father struck his fist against the bedroom door, and the twins jumped out of bed and began yelling around the bedroom, instantly filled with energy. As in a cartoon, into the bedroom drifted tendrils of the odor of frying bacon. My brothers jostled toward the bathroom. Water rushed into the sink and the toilet bowl, and my mother hurried in, her face tightened down over her cigarette, and began yanking the twins into their clothes. "You made your decision," she said to me. "Now I hope you're going to make it to the playground on time." Doors opened, doors slammed shut. My father shouted from the kitchen, and I got out of bed. Eventually I sat down before the bowl of cereal. My father smoked and did not meet my eyes. The cereal tasted of dead leaves. "You look the way that asshole upstairs plays piano," my father said. He dropped quarters on the table and told me not to lose that money. After he left, I locked myself in the bedroom. The piano dully resounded overhead like a soundtrack. I heard the cups and dishes rattle and the sink, the furniture moving by itself, looking for something to hunt down and kill. "Love me, love me," the radio called from beside a family of brown and white porcelain spaniels. I heard some light, whispery thing, a lamp or a magazine, begin to slide around the living room. "I am imagining all this," I said to myself, and tried to concentrate on a Black Hawk comic book. The pictures jigged and melted in their panels. "Love me," Black Hawk cried out from the cockpit of his fighter as he swooped down to exterminate a nest of yellow slant-eyed villains. Outside, fire raged beneath the streets, trying to pull the world apart. When I dropped the comic book and closed my eyes, the noises ceased, and I could hear the hovering stillness of perfect attention. Even Black Hawk, belted into his airplane within the comic book, was listening to what I was doing. In thick, hazy sunlight, I went down Sherman Boulevard toward the Orpheum Oriental. Around me, the world was motionless, frozen, like a frame in a comic strip. After a time, I noticed that the cars on the boulevard and the few people on the sidewalk had not actually frozen into place, but instead were moving with great slowness. I could see men's legs advancing within their trousers, the knee coming forward to strike the crease, the cuff slowly lifting off the shoe, and the shoe drifting up, like Tomcat's paw when he crept toward Jerry Mouse. The warm, patched skin of Sherman Boulevard. I thought of walking along Sherman Boulevard forever, moving past the nearly immobile cars and people, past the theater, past the liquor store, through the gates, and past the waiting pool and swings, past the elephants and lions reaching out to be fed, past the secret park where my father flailed in a rage of disappointment, past the elms, and out the opposite gate, past the big house on the opposite side of the park, past the picture windows, past the lawns with bikes and plastic pools, past slanting driveways and basketball hoops, past men getting out of cars, past playgrounds where children raced back and forth on a surface shining black, then past fields and crowded markets, past high yellow tractors with mud dried like old wool inside the enormous hubs, past wagons piled high with hay, past deep woods where lost children follow trails of breadcrumbs to a gingerbread door, past other cities where nobody would see me because nobody knew my name, past everything, past everybody. At the Orpheum Oriental, I stopped still. My mouth was dry, my eyes would not focus. Everything around me, so quiet and still a moment earlier, jumped into life as soon as I stopped walking. Horns blared, cars roared down the boulevard. Beneath these sounds, I heard the pounding of great machines and the fires gobbling up oxygen beneath the street. As if I had eaten them from the air, fire and smoke poured into my stomach. Flame slipped out of my throat and sealed the back of my mouth. In my mind, I saw myself taking the first quarter from my pocket, exchanging it for a ticket, pushing through the door, and moving into the cool air. I saw myself holding out the ticket to be torn in half, going over an endless brown carpet toward the inner door. From the last row of seats on the other side of the inner door, inside the shadowy but not yet dark theater, a shapeless monster whose wet black mouth said, "Love me, love me," stretched yearning arms toward me. Shock froze my shoes to the sidewalk, and then shoved me firmly in the small of the back, and I was running down the block, unable to scream because I had to clamp my lips against the smoke and the fire trying to explode from my mouth. The rest of that afternoon remains vague. I wandered through the streets, not in the clean, hollow way I had imagined, but almost blindly, hot and uncertain. I remember the taste of fire in my mouth and the loudness of my heart. After a time, I found myself before the elephant enclosure in the zoo. A newspaper reporter in a neat gray suit passed through the space before me, and I followed him, knowing that he carried a notebook in his pocket, that he had been beaten by gangsters, that he could locate the speaking secret that hid beneath the disconnected and dismembered pieces of the world. He would fire his pistol on an empty chamber and trick evil Solly Wellman, Barry Kroger, with his girlish, watchful eyes. And when Solly Wellman came gloating out of the shadows, the reporter would shoot him dead. Dead. Donna Reed smiled down from an upstairs window. Has there ever been a smile like that? Ever? I was in Chicago, and behind a closed door, Blackie Francho bled onto a brown carpet. Solly Wellman, something like Solly Wellman, called and called to me from the decorated grave where he lay like a secret. The man in the gray suit finally carried his notebook and his gun through a front door, and I saw that I was only a few blocks from home. Paul leans against the wire fence surrounding the playground, looking out, looking backward. Alan Ladd brushes off Leona, June Havoc, for she has no history that matters, and exists only in the world of work and pleasure, of cigarettes and cocktail bars. Beneath this world is another, and Leona's life is a blind, strenuous denial of that other world. My mother held her hand to my forehead and declared that I not only had a fever, but I had been building up to it all week. I was not to go to the playground the next day. I had to spend the day lying down on Mrs. Candy's couch. When she lifted the telephone to call one of the high school girls, I said, "Don't bother. Other kids were gone all the time." And she put down the receiver. I lay on Mrs. Candy's couch, staring up at the ceiling of her darkened living room. The twins squabbled outside. The maternal, slow-witted Mrs. Candy brought me orange juice. The twins ran toward the sandbox, and Mrs. Candy groaned as she let herself fall into a wobbly lawn chair. The morning newspaper folded beneath the lawn chair said The Hitchhiker and Double Cross had begun playing at the Orpheum Oriental. Chicago Deadline had done its work and traveled on. It had broken the world in half and sealed the monster deep within. Nobody but me knew this. Up and down the block, sprinklers whirred, whipping loops of water onto the dry lawns. Men, driving slowly up and down the street, hung their elbows out of their windows. For a moment, free of regret and nearly without emotion of any kind, I understood that I belonged utterly to myself. Like everything else, I had been torn asunder and glued back together with shock, vomit, and orange juice. The knowledge sifted into me that I was all alone. Stan, Jimmy, whatever his name was, would never come back to the theater. He would be afraid that I had told my parents and the police about him. I knew that I had killed him by forgetting him. And then I forgot him again. The next day I went back to the theater and went through the inner door and saw row after row of empty seats falling toward the curtain screen. I was all alone. The size and grandeur of the theater surprised me. I went down the long descending aisle and took the last seat left side on the broad middle aisle. The next row seemed nearly a playground's distance away. The lights dimmed and the curtains rippled slowly away from the screen. Anticipatory music filled the air, and the first letters appeared on the screen. What I am, what I do, why I do it. I am simultaneously a man in his early 40s, that treacherous time, and a boy of 7, before whose bravery I shall forever fall short. I live underground in a wooden room, and patiently, in joyful concentration, decorate the walls. Before me, half unseen, hangs a large and appallingly complicated vision I must explore and memorize, must witness again and again in order to locate its hidden center. Around me, everything is in its proper place. My typewriter sits on the sturdy table. Beside the typewriter, a cigarette smolders, raising a gray stream of smoke. A record revolves on the turntable, and my small apartment is dense with music. Bird of Prey blues with Coleman Hawkins, Buck Clayton, and Hank Jones. Beyond my walls and windows is a world toward which I reach with outstretched arms and an ambitious and divided heart. As if Bird of Prey Blues has evoked them, the voices of sentences to be written this afternoon, tomorrow, or next month stir and whisper, beginning to speak, and I lean over the typewriter toward them, getting as close as I can.
Primeval, Secrets and Shadows was read by Lisa McMillan and James B. Sicking. Charles L. Grant wrote Spinning Tales with the Dead. Thomas Ligotti wrote Alice's Last Adventure. And Peter Straub wrote The Juniper Tree. Production coordinator was Elisa Shokoff. Recording engineers were Gary Fink and Chris Solem. Mix engineer and editor was Karen Perlman. Primeval was produced and directed by Susan Perrin. I'm Douglas Winter, editor of Prime Evil.